Part 1, Before. Chapter 1, The Ordinary Life. David Jacobson had performed 1,400 and some knee and hip replacements in his career, a number he knew precisely because Elena had once asked him over dinner and he'd realized, with some embarrassment, that he'd been keeping count without meaning to. It was a Portland number, a Pill Hill number. Oregon Health and Science University sat on its bluff above the city the way David's life sat on its own quiet elevation, orderly, elevated, a little removed from the traffic below. He was 49. He had been in medicine for 25 years, married to Elena for 26, and he had reached the age where those two numbers had started to feel like the only real biography he had, how long he'd fixed people, how long he'd loved one particular person. He kept a whiteboard in his home office that Elena teased him about constantly, a grid of the week's surgeries, color-coded by procedure, updated every Sunday night with the specific satisfaction of a man who found peace in visible order. It was, Elena said, the closest thing David had to a hobby. He didn't entirely disagree. He read medical journals the way other men watched football, and on the rare Saturday he found himself with nothing scheduled. He became visibly uneasy by early afternoon, prowling the garage for some project, a fence board that needed replacing, a bike chain that didn't strictly need oiling, until Elena would find him and say, gently, "You're allowed to just sit, David," and he would sit, for about 11 minutes, before finding something to fix. The house on Everett Street had 4 bedrooms and a view, on clear days, of Mount Hood, and it had absorbed, over 18 years, the specific archaeology of a family. Marcus's childhood height marks climbed a closet doorframe that Elena refused to paint over. The pencil lines dated in David's cramped surgeon's handwriting, M, age 4, M, age 7, M, age 11, stopping abruptly at 17 when Marcus, 6 feet tall by then, had declared himself done growing and, more importantly, done being measured. Caleb's room held a shelf of bird skulls, found on hikes and cleaned with a patience that unsettled his mother slightly, arranged according to a taxonomic system only Caleb fully understood, alongside a stack of field notebooks going back to when he was 11. Zoe's door had transitioned, somewhere around her 12th birthday, from a hand-painted mural of cartoon animals, Elena's work, from when Zoe was small enough to think her mother could do anything, to a hand-lettered keep-out sign in Zoe's own increasingly confident cursive, and had stayed that way, a border the rest of the family had learned, mostly, to respect. Finn's room was still bright with the primary colors Elena had chosen when he was born, blues and reds that 9-year-olds, it turned out, did not yet care to redecorate the way 14-year-olds cared about almost everything. Elena had been an emergency room nurse for 11 years before she became, more improbably, a wellness blogger with 400,000 followers and the book deal she had not yet finished the manuscript for, 8 months past its second extended deadline. A fact she managed not to think about except at 3 in the morning roughly once a week. She had left the ER the year Finn was born, not because she had stopped loving the work, she still dreamed about it sometimes. Vivid clinical dreams full of monitor alarms and the particular cadence of a code being called, but because she had reached a specific night, a car accident involving 3 teenagers, one of whom did not survive the operating room despite everything anyone did, after which she found she could not walk back through the ER's sliding doors without her hands shaking first. In the parking lot. She had told David this once, only once, sitting in the driveway at 2 in the morning after her last shift, and he had not tried to talk her out of the decision, only reached across the console and held her hand until the shaking stopped. Her blog, The Unhurried Life, had begun almost as therapy, a place to write down the small, unglamorous mechanics of getting a family of 6 fed and rested and functioning, and had grown, over 7 years, into something she still occasionally found strange to think about. Strangers in Nebraska and Singapore and Cape Town reading her thoughts on sleep schedules and school lunches, and the particular grief of watching a child stop needing you in quite the same way. She had researched, for various posts over the years, an embarrassing range of survival-adjacent topics, water purification for a piece on emergency preparedness, Wilderness first aid for an article about a family camping trip gone briefly wrong. Edible plant identification for a series on foraging that had performed, she recalled with some irony now, disappointingly in her analytics. She had never once imagined needing any of it for real. Marcus, 22, had just finished 4 years at UCLA pre-med, magna cum laude, the first Jacobson to complete a degree David hadn't spent the preceding 18 years quietly panicking about paying for. He had his father's build and his mother's habit of narrating his own thought process out loud, a trait that made him either endearing or exhausting depending on how recently you'd heard him explain, at length, the optimal way to load a dishwasher. He had not yet decided on a specialty, though everyone in the family privately assumed surgery, following his father, and Marcus himself had not strongly objected to the assumption, mostly because he hadn't found a compelling enough reason not to. Caleb, 18, occupied a specific and comfortable place in the family as the quiet one, not shy, exactly, but economical with language in a way that made his rare long sentences land with unusual weight. He had spent his entire senior year of high school corresponding with a conservation nonprofit in Costa Rica, and had a gap year placement confirmed for the following September. 6 months monitoring a sea turtle nesting program on the OSA Peninsula, a placement he had wanted so specifically and pursued so single-mindedly that David sometimes forgot Caleb was still, technically, a teenager rather than already a junior field biologist who happened to still live at home. Zoe, 14, was in the specific and volatile territory of early high school, testing every boundary her family had ever set with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist running a controlled experiment. She had, that spring, quit the soccer team she'd played since 2nd grade, taken up photography with sudden and complete intensity, and begun, tentatively, questioning things about her family's faith that she had accepted without examination for 13 years. Not rejecting it, exactly, more holding it at the specific testing distance that Elena recognized, with some private amusement, from her own 14-year-old self. Finn, 9, was simply Finn, curious in a way that had not yet been trained into narrower channels by school or social pressure, capable of asking 60 consecutive questions about a single ant on a sidewalk, beloved by his older siblings with the specific tenderness people reserve for the family member too young to be a rival for anything. Chapter 2, The Decision. The idea of the cruise had come together over a Sunday dinner in February, in the offhand way major family decisions sometimes do, not a plan so much as several separate wishes that happened to align. 25 years, Elena had said, refilling David's wine glass without being asked, which was her particular way of starting a conversation she'd already half decided the outcome of. That's not nothing. That deserves something. It deserves a plaque, David said. OHSU gives out plaques. It deserves you not being in an operating room for 3 straight weeks, Elena said, which I am fairly sure has not happened since our honeymoon. Marcus, home for the weekend from his last quarter at UCLA, had looked up from his phone with the specific alertness of a 22-year-old who had just heard an opportunity. I graduate in June, he said. Just saying. If we're doing milestones. You're applying for 2 years of your life, Caleb said, not looking up from the bird guide he was cross-referencing against a photo on his own phone. That's a bigger milestone than graduating from the part where other people were still deciding things for you. Thank you, Caleb, Marcus said. Very supportive. I'm just saying the actual milestone is Costa Rica, Caleb said, mildly, and went back to his birds, and nobody could quite tell if he was joking. Zoe, working through a plate of pasta with the specific disengagement of someone who had already decided this conversation had nothing to do with her, said, without looking up, if this turns into a vacation, I am not going somewhere with no Wi-Fi. I have things happening this summer. What things? Elena said. Things, Zoe said, which settled the matter as far as she was concerned. Finn, 9 years old and unburdened by any of the strategic considerations occupying his older siblings, simply said, Can we go somewhere with a pool on the boat? And when told that yes, in fact, Most cruise ships did have pools, considered the matter entirely closed, and asked to be excused to finish a Lego set he was building in the other room. It took 3 more weeks of research, David running actuarial-grade comparisons between operators the way he compared surgical outcomes data, Elena reading reviews with the specific skepticism of someone who had once, professionally, seen exactly how badly things could go wrong on a supposedly safe vacation, before they settled on the Celestia, a 120-foot charter yacht operated by Celestia Pacific Cruises, offering a 21-day route through the Philippine archipelago that both David and Elena found, independently, extravagant in a way that made them slightly uncomfortable and booked anyway. "We can afford it," David told Elena, the night they finalized it, in the tone of a man reassuring himself as much as her. "I've never once taken this family somewhere just because we could. I want to do that." Once. Zoe protested for another 2 weeks, with diminishing conviction, until a school friend's enthusiastic reaction to hearing about the trip, "Wait, you're going to the Philippines on an actual yacht? That's insane. Take so many pictures," quietly converted her objection into something closer to reluctant anticipation, which she did not admit to anyone but wrote, briefly, in a notes app on her phone that would not survive the crossing. They spent the last week of packing in the particular chaos of a large family preparing for something none of them had quite done before, Elena's meticulous packing lists taped to the refrigerator, Finn attempting to bring 4 stuffed animals and being talked down to 1, Marcus discovering his passport had 6 months left on its validity and spending an anxious morning confirming this was, in fact, sufficient. David took the boys to get their first cholera and typhoid boosters at a travel clinic near the hospital, and stood afterward in the parking lot with Marcus, both of them rolling their sleeves. Backed down, and found himself, unexpectedly, moved by the simple fact of his oldest son standing next to him as an adult rather than a patient he was responsible for. "You nervous?" David asked. "About the residency stuff." "After this." "A little," Marcus admitted. "Mostly I keep thinking I have 3 more weeks before I have to think about it, and I'm trying to actually believe that." "Good instinct," David said. "Believe it as hard as you can." They flew into Manila on a Tuesday in early March, 6 Jacobsons and 11 pieces of luggage, and boarded the Celestia the following morning under a sky so clear and a sea so improbably blue that Zoe, despite herself, took 40 photographs before lunch. Chapter 3, 11 Days. The Celestia was everything the brochure had promised and, David admitted privately to Elena on the second night, more than he was entirely comfortable with, teak decking that a crew member polished every morning before breakfast, a chef who produced, with apparent effortlessness, meals that made Elena's careful home cooking feel briefly, unfairly, ordinary by comparison, a captain named Oestreicher, gray-bearded and Dutch and reticent in a way Finn found endlessly fascinating, asking him question after question that Oestreicher answered with a patience that surprised the rest of the family. They island-hopped south through water so clear that from the deck you could watch the shadow of the whole glide over reef formations 40 feet below. On the third day, they snorkeled a reef where Caleb identified 14 species of fish before lunch with a running commentary the crew's marine guide found genuinely impressive rather than merely tolerated, and correctly predicted, from the specific shape of a distant cloud formation, that they'd see rain by evening, a prediction that made David laugh outright and ruffled his son's hair in a gesture Caleb hadn't allowed since he was 11, and permitted now with only a small, embarrassed roll of his eyes. Marcus spent much of the crossing on his phone despite the spotty satellite Wi-Fi, refreshing residency program pages with a compulsiveness Elena gently teased him about, until David pulled him aside on the 5th day and said, simply, "You have 3 weeks where nothing about your future can change no matter how many times you check." Put it away for one of them, and Marcus, to his own mild surprise, did, spending the 6th day instead fishing off the stern with one of the crew, catching nothing, laughing more than he had in months. Zoe found, over the first week, that her resistance to the trip had been almost entirely theoretical. She photographed everything, the way morning light moved across water, the specific texture of a fisherman's boat they passed near a village where the Celestia anchored for an afternoon. Finn faced the exact moment he saw his first sea turtle from the boat's railing. She filled 2 memory cards and started, privately, drafting captions for an account she planned to post once they had reliable signal again. Sentences she was, for the first time in longer than she'd admit, genuinely proud of. Finn adopted a member of the crew, a young deckhand named Pepito who taught him to tie a bowline knot and answered, with visible patience, an escalating series of questions about how the boat's engine worked, how deep the ocean was here, whether sharks could smell fear, and whether Pepito had ever seen a ghost. By the 5th day, the crew had taken to calling Finn Little Admiral, a title he wore with complete seriousness and reported to his family at dinner each night with updates on his supposed nautical responsibilities. On the 11th night, over a dinner the chef had prepared with particular ceremony, David's 25th year in medicine and Marcus's diploma, both being marked at once, David stood with a glass of wine he barely touched and found himself, to his own mild surprise, briefly unable to speak. 25 years, he said finally. And this, all of you, here, this is the part one didn't expect when I started. I thought the job was going to be the whole story. It's not even the interesting chapter. Elena cried a little, the good kind, wiping her eyes with the corner of a cloth napkin and laughing at herself for doing it. Zoe rolled her eyes theatrically and then, when she thought no one was watching, wrote the toast down word for word in her phone's notes app so she wouldn't forget it, a habit she'd apparently absorbed from somewhere without noticing, the specific instinct to preserve a sentence before it could get away from her. It was the last entirely ordinary night of their lives, though none of them knew to mark it as such. Somewhere south of them, over open water, still 400 miles distant, a pressure system that did not yet have a name was beginning, with the patient indifference of weather, to turn. Part 2, The Storm and the Shore. Chapter 4, What the Sea Wanted. Captain Oestreicher excused himself from the guest table at 9 o'clock on the 12th night, early and without much explanation, and Elena, 11 years of triage instinct not so easily retired even 7 years out of the ER, read the room correctly before anyone said a word. She watched the junior steward refill water glasses too quickly, watched him not quite meet anyone's eyes, and felt the specific, wordless alarm of a nurse recognizing the 6 seconds before a code without yet knowing what was coding. Something's wrong, she said quietly to David, under the noise of Finn describing, at some length, a jellyfish he'd seen that afternoon. Probably just weather, David said, though he'd noticed it too, the crew's sudden briskness, a kind of choreography that had nothing to do with dinner service. By 10, deck crew were moving along the rails, checking lines with a thoroughness that had not been part of the ship's usual evening routine. By 11, the Celestia was running south-southwest at a speed Marcus, feeling the engine's changed pitch through the deck, estimated as full throttle, trying to outrun a pressure system the satellite feed had shown, at dinner, developing into something the onboard software had not yet been willing to name. Zoe woke at midnight to a motion in the cabin that felt fundamentally different from the gentle roll of the previous 11 nights, a heavier, more deliberate lurch, the ship's whole structure seeming to groan with each swell. She lay in her bunk for a long moment, feeling her stomach drop with each rise and fall, before deciding the not knowing was worse than whatever she'd find if she got up. She found her parents in the corridor outside the cabins, both dressed, both wearing the specific calm David and Elena reserved for situations that actually warranted alarm, a calm Zoe had learned, over 14 years, to read is more frightening than panic would have been. Go wake your brothers, Elena said. Life jackets on. Now, not in a minute. Are we sinking? Zoe asked, and hated herself immediately for how young the question made her sound. We're being careful, Elena said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. By midnight, the sea had stopped behaving like water and started behaving like something with intent. It would be called Tropical Cyclone Haraya by the Manila Weather Bureau by morning, from the Tagalog word for something dreamed of, hoped for, though at 2:47 in the morning. As the Celestia buckled over a swell David estimated afterward at 30 feet, the name meant nothing to anyone aboard. What mattered was the sound, a sustained, orchestral roar that David would later describe in his journal as being inside an engine that had decided to become the sky. He was the only passenger on deck when the rogue wave hit. He'd gone up for air, the cabin's rolling having become suffocating, and some part of him unable to simply sit and wait, and had looped his forearm through the stern rail seconds before a black wall of water arrived out of the southeast without announcement, some older instinct in his body sensing what his eyes had not yet registered. It was not dramatic in the way waves are dramatic in films. It was simply enormous, the physical scale of it lifting the Celestia's stern and throwing it sideways with a sound like a building collapsing. The deck lurched to 40 degrees. David was thrown against the winch housing hard enough to bruise 3 ribs he wouldn't examine for another week, and when he pulled himself upright, hands shaking in a way he would not fully register until much later, the bridge was dark and someone below was screaming in the high, flat register of pure disorientation, not pain. He fought his way below through a companionway at a lift so severe he had to brace with both hands against opposite walls. He found his family on the floor of the main cabin, alive, in a tangle of fallen furniture, Finn crying, not from injury but from the specific terror of a 9-year-old whose entire framework for how the world worked had just been violently revised, Zoe gripping Caleb's arm with white knuckles, Marcus already pulling himself up, moving toward his mother. First Officer Reyes, a young Filipino woman, competent, terrified in the specific controlled way of someone whose training was the only thing between her and panic, stood at the emergency radio shouting coordinates into static that answered with nothing but more static. She turned when David entered, and her face told him everything the words hadn't yet. The hull was compromised below the waterline. The engine room had lost power entirely. Captain Oestreicher had ordered the lifeboats away 10 minutes prior. "Where's the captain now?" David asked. "Boats," Reyes said. He went with the boats. The crew, by every instinct of their training, had gone to the boats. The Jacobsons, by every instinct of their family, went to each other. It took David and Elena 6 minutes. They would never agree afterward on whether it had felt longer or shorter, to locate all 4 children in the chaos of a listing ship, Marcus in the forward cabin, thrown from his bunk but unhurt. Already helping crew members, he passed brace fallen equipment, Caleb beside him, moving toward the door before anyone told him to, his flashlight already out and sweeping the corridor with the specific methodical calm that would define his entire 2 years on the island to come. Zoe and Finn, found by Elena huddled together in the shower stall of the family's shared bathroom, because, Finn explained later with perfect 9-year-old logic, the walls of the head were the strongest walls on the boat, an observation that would turn out, in its essentials, to be entirely correct. By the time all 6 Jacobsons were assembled in the saloon, soaked and gripping each other's arms against the ship's violent motion, the lifeboats were gone. Through a shattered porthole, David could see the orange bloom of a flare somewhere in the darkness, 200 meters off and receding fast, swallowed within seconds by the storm. The Celestia had, by David's best estimate, perhaps 20 minutes left before she went under entirely. "Okay," he said. He said it the way he said it in an operating room when a patient's pressure dropped without warning, not frightened, not false, but present in a way that left no space for any alternative. Elena would say, years later, that this was the exact moment she understood her husband in a way 26 years of marriage had not quite prepared her for, watching him become, in real time, the version of himself that had spent 25 years learning exactly how to function when everything depended on it. "Here is what we are going to do." They had the 6-person emergency raft stowed beneath the saloon bench, never opened, never so much as discussed on the entire crossing beyond a single safety briefing none of them had paid full attention to. Marcus found the release and pulled, the raft inflated with a chemical pop that made Finn, even in his terror, sneeze reflexively. They had life jackets, already on, already checked twice by David with the specific thoroughness of a man double-checking a surgical count. David dragged a waterproof kit from the companionway, flares, a handheld VHF radio, a compass, a mylar blanket, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, protein bars, a signal mirror, the contents of which he would, within a week, know by heart the way he knew the anatomy of a knee joint. Elena, Finn first, then Zoe, David said. Marcus is Caleb, help me hold the raft against the swell while they get in. The transition from a sinking ship to an inflatable raft in a Category 3 cyclone was, David would write later, the single most physically violent 90 seconds of his life. The raft rising and slamming against the Celestia's hull with each swell. Elena passing Finn across a gap that opened and closed like a held breath, Zoe half jumping, half falling into Marcus's arms on the other side. David went last, Caleb ahead of him, both of them cutting the tether the moment they were aboard and paddling, immediately and with everything they had, away from the sinking ship's suction radius. The Celestia went down without further drama. No whirlpool, no dying groan audible over the storm, the sea simply closed over her, and then there was nothing left in the world but the raft, the storm, and 6 people who had, 11 days earlier, been arguing tearfully about whether the ship's Wi-Fi counted as a human right. Chapter 5, 9 hours. They drifted 9 hours, though none of them, in the moment, could have told you it was 9 hours rather than 9 days. Time in the raft stopped functioning as a normal measurement and became instead a series of discrete, overwhelming sensations strung together. The specific cold of being wet and wind, the raft's floor flexing underneath them with every swell. The taste of salt that would not leave anyone's mouth for what felt, afterward, like weeks. Elena held Finn against her chest with both arms locked from the first hour, her body curved protectively over his in a position that would leave her shoulders aching for 3 days afterward, an ache she would not mention to anyone because there were, by any reasonable accounting, more important things to mention. Finn cried for the first hour, then stopped, not because he was comforted, Elena understood, but because a 9-year-old's body could apparently only sustain that specific pitch of terror for a finite amount of time before something in him simply switched the terror off, or set it aside, the way a computer might, and Finn slept, impossibly, for 4 of the 9 hours, his head against his mother's collarbone, while the storm continued to do its worst around them. Zoe gripped the rope handle along the raft's interior rim hard enough to leave a mark she'd noticed 2 days later and not remember getting. She spent the hours doing something she would later recognize, writing about it in her notebook, as a specific kind of dissociative math, counting waves, counting her own breaths, counting the individual strands of the rope handle under her palm, anything to keep her mind occupied with something small enough to actually hold, rather than the much larger and much less holdable fact of what had just happened to the boat that had, 20 minutes earlier, contained everything she owned. Marcus and Caleb took turns paddling with their bare hands against waves that made the paddling almost entirely symbolic, a gesture of doing something in a situation where there was, in truth, very little to be done except endure it. Marcus found himself, somewhere around hour 3, running through anatomy flashcards in his head, a study habit so deeply grooved into him after 4 years of pre-med that his mind reached for it automatically under stress, the way another person's mind might reach for a prayer or a song. He did not tell anyone this until much later, when it had become, retold at the family fire on the island, a story that made everyone laugh. The ship sank and my brain's first move was to quiz itself on the brachial plexus. David held the compass to his phone's flashlight, trying to remember, from a hemisphere and a lifetime away, which direction land was supposed to lie, cross-referencing a mental map assembled from 11 days of glancing at the Celestia's charted route without ever expecting to need to reconstruct it from memory in the dark. He did not know, in truth, whether the direction he chose to paddle toward was correct. He chose one anyway, because a family adrift needed a direction more than they needed a correct one, and told everyone, with total conviction he did not entirely feel, that they were heading toward land. Elena prayed, her lips moving and mostly no sound coming out beneath the wind, and asked God, in the specific bargaining language of the truly frightened, that if they survived this she would spend the rest of her life saying thank you for it, a promise she would remember, and examine, and ultimately revise, many months later, in a hotel room in Bongal with clean sheets and air conditioning and the specific disorientation of safety. Zoe, holding the rope handle, did not pray, and noted the fact to herself with the same flat precision she would bring to every entry in the notebook she had not yet started keeping. I didn't say it because I wasn't sure yet whether I meant it, she would write, days later, reconstructing the moment from memory. I filed the omission away as something to examine later, when there was time, which there currently, catastrophically, was not. Somewhere around hour 6, the worst of the storm began, almost imperceptibly at first, to pass, the wind dropping from a scream to a roar to something nearly loud, the swells lengthening from the vicious, close-packed chop of the storm's core into a longer, more survivable rolling motion. Nobody said anything about it at first, afraid to jinx a change they weren't yet certain was real. It was Caleb, watching the sky with the same attentiveness he brought to everything, who finally said, quietly, the clouds are moving faster than we are now. That's good. That means the worst of it's ahead of us, not on top of us. Nobody asked him how he knew this. Nobody would spend much time, over the coming 2 years, questioning how Caleb knew the things he knew. They had already begun, without discussing it, to trust him on exactly this kind of observation, a trust that would prove, again and again, to be well placed. By hour 8, the sky had begun, almost tentatively, to lighten in the east, not sunrise yet, but the specific quality of pre-dawn gray that meant sunrise was coming, that the night, at least, had an end point. David felt something in his chest loosen slightly, allowing himself, for the first time since the wave hit, a small and cautious hope that they might actually survive this. Chapter 6, Land. Caleb saw it first. He always saw things first, a habit of noticing before being told to notice that had, at home, mostly gotten him labeled a quiet kid who liked birds, and that would, on the island, turn out to be the single most valuable trait in the family's possession. He straightened in the raft, which had gone, in the last hour, from a place of pure terror to something closer to exhausted numbness, and stared southeast, where a black shape sat low against the lightning sky with the solid, ancient patience of something that had been there a very long time. Land, he said, and said nothing else for a long moment, which was also characteristic. The word moved through the raft like a current. Finn woke instantly, as if the single syllable had reached him through sleep more effectively than the entire storm had. Elena's grip on him loosened slightly, her whole body angling toward the horizon Caleb was pointing at. Marcus stopped paddling and simply stared. Zoe let go of the rope handle for the first time in 8 hours and felt her hand cramp painfully as it uncurled. It emerged from the dawn the way islands do in that part of the Pacific, not with drama but with gradual, impossible substance. First a ridgeline silhouette against pearl-gray sky. Then the darker mass of jungle canopy, terraced up a central hill. Then color, a green so saturated it seemed to glow, the specific chlorophyll intensity of a place where rain is abundant and human interference is not. Beneath it, a crescent of white sand. Beneath that, water the pale aquamarine of shallow reef, breaking in long, gentle, entirely unstorm-like lines, the cyclone, they would understand later, having passed to the north of the island, leaving behind only its rolling aftermath. It was, by any measure, beautiful, and that fact registered with all of them even through 9 hours of exhaustion and fear. Zoe, who had a photographer's eye even without a camera, her actual camera somewhere at the bottom of the Sulu Sea along with everything else that had been in her cabin, said it looked like her old laptop screensaver and then felt embarrassed for saying it, for finding a comparison so small for something so overwhelming. Marcus's jaw unclenched for the first time since the wave hit. Elena began praying again, this time with her face turned toward the shore and an expression David had seen only a handful of times in 26 years of marriage. The look of someone watching something be decided by forces larger than any negotiation she could offer. An expression somewhere between terror and awe that David would think about, on and off, for the rest of his life. They made the beach on the third attempt, tumbled by a final wave that spilled all 6 of them into waist-deep water, the raft flipping and dragging them under for a disorienting few seconds before everyone found their footing on sand. Finn came up laughing, the first laugh in 9 hours, and it struck David, sitting in the shallows with salt water in his eyes, with the specific force of a bell rung in an otherwise silent room. He would remember that laugh, specifically, as the moment he allowed himself to believe they might actually be all right. The beach ran perhaps 400 meters between 2 black volcanic outcroppings that jutted into the surf-like fins. Coconut palms fringed the tide line, their fronds moving in the wind with a sound like distant applause. Behind them, jungle began, dense, dark, alive with birdsong and the drip of recent rain, indifferent, in its ancient way, to the 6 exhausted strangers who had just arrived at its edge. David sat in the sand, his ribs aching sharply with every breath, and did what he had always done with disaster. He took inventory. It was, Elena would say later, the single most David thing he could have done in that moment, and also, she understood even as she watched him do it, exactly the right thing, a way of converting overwhelming loss into a list of manageable facts. One deflated raft, dragged above the tide line by Marcus and Caleb before it could be pulled back out by the surf. One waterproof emergency kit, its contents still intact. 6 protein bars. A VHF radio whose battery indicator was already sliding toward yellow. 4 smartphones, all soaked, all showing no signal, 1 ice fins, cracked across the screen from the raft's violent landing. 3 credit cards, absurd to even consider useful. 12 liters of fresh water for 6 people, in tropical heat that was already, by mid-morning, beginning to feel oppressive. We're alive, Elena said, sitting beside him in the sand, Finn already wandering a few feet away to investigate a shell. David. We're all alive. All 6 of us. All 6, David repeated, and found, for the second time that morning, that he could not immediately speak past the specific tightness in his throat. Elena organized what remained of the morning while David walked the beach's length, cataloging terrain the way he'd once cataloged a patient's chart, assessing, without yet fully articulating it to himself, what this stretch of sand and jungle might offer a family with nothing but what had washed up with them. Marcus hauled the emergency kit above the high tide line, checking and rechecking the seal on the waterproof case with the specific compulsiveness of someone needing a task to steady his hands. Caleb was sent to the tree line for windfall coconuts, not yet permitted to climb, and returned within 20 minutes with 4, cracked open with a rock, their water sweet and strange, and the first thing any of them had eaten or drunk since the ship's last dinner nearly 12 hours earlier. Zoe, having claimed the kit's multi-tool with something close to reverence, cut strips of raft fabric for shade cloth, rigging a crude awning between 2 low palms with a competence that surprised her more than anyone. Finn was dispatched on important bird watching, a 9-year-old's job, invented on the spot by Elena to keep him near the adults without making him feel managed, a small mercy of purpose in a morning that otherwise offered him none. Within the hour Finn returned with information that would matter more than anyone yet understood. There was a stream. He'd followed a monitor lizard, nearly as long as he was, he reported, with real pride, sketching its size in the air with both hands, into the palms, and the lizard had led him to fresh water, moving over smooth black stone, 50 meters into the trees. He had been sent to watch birds. He had found water instead. Nobody pointed out the discrepancy. He had, in his own accounting, clearly done both, and the family, gathering around the news of fresh water with a relief so total that Elena briefly had to sit down, agreed, wordlessly, that he had. They slept that first night under the raft fabric awning, all 6 of them pressed close together on sand still faintly warm from the day's heat, exhausted past the point of fear, and none of them, not even David, cataloging worst-case scenarios out of long professional habit, could have said, that first night, how long they would actually be there. 12 days, he privately guessed, watching the stars emerge with a clarity Portland's light pollution never allowed. Perhaps 3 weeks at the absolute outside, if the search took a while to organize. He would be wrong by a factor of nearly 60. Part 3. 2 years, the work of becoming. Undoubtedly philosophers are in the right when they tell us that nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, 1726. Chapter 7. What the Sea Left Behind. The wreck gave them more than they deserved, David would write later, meaning not that they were unworthy of it but that disaster's arithmetic rarely favors the stranded. On the second morning the tide began delivering debris, and the family spent the day wading into surf still churned from the storm's passage, hauling in whatever the Celestia had released back to them. A fiberglass cockpit panel came first, identified by Marcus from its curve as part of the ship's stern combing. Then a sealed deck box, wedged between 2 rocks at the tide line, holding fishing gear and a folding saw and a spare handheld GPS unit whose satellite link was dead but whose internal charts still worked, a discovery that made David, examining it on the beach, briefly lightheaded with relief, since a chart of even limited accuracy was infinitely better than the total geographic blindness they'd woken up with. A shrink-wrapped case of water bottles had floated intact, its plastic wrap somehow unbroken by the crossing. A great coil of marine-grade rope, heavy and salt-stiffened, would prove in the coming months to be their single most valuable material possession, more useful in the end than either the saw or the GPS. A soft-sided cooler yielded canned food, vacuum-sealed rice, instant coffee that none of them would touch for another 8 months out of a strange, unspoken sense that instant coffee belonged to their old life and drinking it now would be a kind of forgetting, matches in a waterproof case, and a bottle of olive oil that Elena would ration, drop by drop, for cooking for the better part of a year. And, absurdly, a child's life jacket printed with cartoon sea turtles, claimed by Finn and worn, essentially without interruption, for 4 consecutive days, until Elena finally convinced him to let it dry out properly overnight. Marcus and David waded out repeatedly that second day, each trip a calculated risk against the surf still unpredictable from the storm's aftermath, hauling in what they could reach and leaving what they couldn't. Elena stood at the tide line and called direction, her ER training reasserting itself in the specific way she assessed each hazard before either of them went in. Wait for the set to pass. David, don't go now. A competence Marcus would later say had probably kept his father from a serious injury at least twice that week alone. Caleb went waist-deep with the rope, looping it around larger pieces of debris to drag them the last stretch to shore, working with a steadiness that belied his age. By noon on the second day, they had a salvage pile on the beach that David estimated, doing the same mental arithmetic he'd once done with a patient's vital signs, represented the equivalent of several weeks of survival advantage. The difference, he understood even then, between a family that might not make it and a family that very possibly would. The folding saw changed everything, and everyone in the family would say so, independently, months and then years later, when asked what single object had mattered most. By the third day, David and Marcus had cut 6 bamboo poles from a grove Caleb located by following the sound of wind moving through hollow canes, a detail that struck Zoe, recording it in the notebook she'd begun that same day, as the kind of thing that sounded made up until you'd watched Caleb do it enough times to simply expect it. By the 5th day, the frame of a lean-to shelter stood on the beach above the tide line, 10 feet by 8, roofed in overlapping palm fronds by a technique David half remembered from a survival video he'd watched years earlier during a slow recovery from a meniscus repair and never expected to need. It was not beautiful. It sagged slightly on one corner that Marcus swore he'd fix and didn't get to for another 4 days. It was, nonetheless, The first thing in 5 days that made all 6 of them feel less like victims and more like people who lived somewhere. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, Day 5, Dad and Marcus built the shelter. Framed today with the saw. It is the ugliest thing I have ever been happy to look at. Mom is already talking about Zones 4 inside it like it's a real house, which considering it's a lean-to made of sticks is either very optimistic or very smart, and knowing Mom, probably both. Caleb found the bamboo grove by following the sound of wind through the hollow canes, which is either impressive or he got lucky, and with him I genuinely cannot tell which. Finn has decided the shelter needs a name and is currently campaigning for Fort Awesome, which Marcus is resisting on principle. The shelter, in the end, was named simply the Frame, in the offhand way that important names sometimes arrive, not chosen, exactly, just noticed, the way David had referred to it once in passing and everyone had continued using the word without discussion. By day 14 it had been rebuilt twice, crossbeams relashed against wind shift using a spiral wrap technique Marcus worked out through several failed attempts, roof pitch steepened to shed the afternoon rain that had, in the first week, turned the shelter's interior into a persistent damp misery, floor finally raised on bamboo joists above the mosquito line that had left every member of the family bitten raw within the first 3 days. They lit the first real signal fire on the ridge that same day, a smaller, cruder version of what would eventually become Marcus's elaborate signal platform 2 years later, but a real fire nonetheless, visible, David hoped, for some meaningful distance out to sea. Marcus, already establishing the habit that would define his 2 years on the island, timed exactly how long it took to build from cold embers to visible smoke, and was disappointed enough in the 11 minutes it took that he spent the following afternoon reorganizing the tinder and kindling into a more efficient arrangement, bringing the time down to just under 7. On day 18, a dog found them. He appeared at the tree line one morning while the family ate a breakfast of coconut and the last of the protein bars, thin but not starved, tawny as old wood, watchful in the particular way of an animal that has been surviving alone and is uncertain what to make of new information. He sat exactly 10 meters from Finn and regarded him for a long while before Finn, with the fearless diplomacy of a 9-year-old, sat down in the sand himself and simply waited him out, not approaching, not calling, just present and patient in a way that impressed even David, watching from a distance. By noon they were sharing lunch. Finn named him Pacific, everything on the island, he reasoned with total seriousness, deserved to be named after the ocean that had brought them there, and within a week the name had worn down, through constant use, to Pack, and Pack had become, without any family vote ever formally taken, a Jacobson in every sense but paperwork. Chapter 8, The First Weeks. The rhythm of those first weeks established itself gradually, each day's tasks dictated by the previous day's discoveries and failures in roughly equal measure. Elena's ER training, dormant for 9 years, reasserted itself with a specificity that startled even her. She found herself automatically assessing infection risk in every scraped knee, automatically triaging the family's collective fatigue and hydration each evening the way she'd once triaged a waiting room, automatically keeping a mental log of every minor injury and its healing progress that would, months later, become the actual medical log she kept on the back pages of Zoe's chart. David's surgical training proved useful in ways he hadn't anticipated, not the specific procedures, which he had, mercifully, no cause to perform in those first weeks, but the underlying discipline of structural thinking, the habit of examining a system, a shelter, a water source, a family's morale, and identifying its failure points before they failed. He began, without quite deciding to, keeping a running mental list titled, in his head, Things That Will Kill Us If We Don't Fix Them, and worked through it with the same methodical urgency he'd once brought to a surgical checklist: dehydration, first, infection, second, exposure, third, despair, fourth, though he did not initially rank despair as seriously as the other 3, a miscalculation he would revise within the month. Marcus denied the specific validation of medical school acceptance letters and residency match results that had occupied his imagination for the entire cruise, found himself instead accumulating a different kind of competence, fishing, initially badly, with a coil of monofilament found in the salvaged fishing kit, fashioned into a handline he had no real idea how to use. His first attempts produced nothing for 3 straight days, a failure that frustrated him more than any exam ever had, precisely because there was no professor to appeal to and no partial credit available. His first catch, on the 4th day, was a parrotfish weighing perhaps 2 kilograms, a creature so vividly, flagrantly colored that he held it in the water for a long moment before making himself think clearly about what it meant for the family's caloric situation, and then brought it in. Caleb pushed into the jungle interior almost daily, cataloging what he found with the same systematic patience he'd once applied to bird skulls on a shelf in Portland, this time in a small, waterproof notebook of his own, separate from Zoe's, filled with sketches and tentative identifications cross-referenced against a downloaded Wikipedia article on tropical edible plants that David had, in a stroke of foresight neither of them would ever be able to fully explain, save to his phone months. Earlier, for an entirely unrelated article Elena had been researching. Caleb found wild yam on the 8th day, growing near the second bend of the stream, and would not let anyone eat it until David had confirmed the identification against the downloaded article twice. Zoe kept the record, the role settling onto her not through assignment but through simple accumulation, the way a habit becomes an identity. She had found the carpenter's pencil in the salvage pile on the 3rd day, round and nearly indestructible, the kind used to mark wood, and had begun writing on the blank back pages of the waterproof chart recovered from the deck box. Her entries were spare and precise, with the occasional burst of feeling she'd immediately cover over with more facts, as though emotion were whether to be logged and moved past rather than lingered in. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, Day 9, Marcus and Dad argued about the fire today, whether to keep it burning all the time as a signal or save the fuel and only light it big when we hear a plane. They didn't really resolve it, they just got tired of arguing, which I've noticed is how a lot of arguments end out here. We're keeping a small fire going all the time and a bigger signal fire ready to light fast. I think that counts as both of them being right, which nobody has said out loud because saying it would mean the argument was pointless, and arguments are never pointless to Marcus. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, Day 11, Water. The stream is clean, boiled anyway because Mom says the tablets take the edge off the risk but boiling takes it all the way off, which is a very Mom sentence. Food, coconuts, getting a little tired of coconuts, would never say that to Dad who counts everyone like it's currency, which I guess it kind of is. 1 parrotfish, Marcus's first catch, huge deal, he wants it noted that it was 2 kilograms, rice from the cooler, being rationed. Finn found another lizard today, a smaller one, and named it Kevin, and is upset that Kevin will not stay in one place to be visited regularly. The days took on, gradually, a structure that was not entirely unlike the routines of the family's ordinary life at home, except that the stakes of each task were vivid and immediate in a way domestic routines rarely are. Marcus fished every morning from the reef's edge, improving steadily as May wore into June, until his early failures became a running family joke he tolerated with reasonably good humor. Caleb foraged and began tending, alongside his father, the first tentative rows of a kitchen garden above the tide line, coaxing wild yam cuttings and banana shoots toward a productivity none of them yet trusted would actually arrive. Zoe kept the water supply running, maintained the fire's log, actual fuel consumption, actual burn times, a level of detail that would have seemed absurd at home and felt, on the island, like the only sane response to genuine scarcity, and wrote. David worked construction and first aid in the endless, meticulous management of their material inventory. Elena cooked, organized, mediated, and, every morning without exception, prayed. Finn did what turned out to be exactly the right thing for a 9-year-old to do, which was mostly everything and nothing, helping where he was needed, wandering where he wasn't, absorbing the island's rhythms with an ease that would, months later, make him the fastest of any of them to master the tide charts by ear alone. Chapter 8a, The Itching Season. Of all the island's discomforts, David would say later, only half joking, the mosquitoes were the one that came closest to breaking something in him that the storm itself had not managed to touch. A rogue wave was violent but finite, it arrived, did its damage, and was over. The mosquitoes were neither violent nor finite. They were simply, relentlessly, permanently there, a low and undramatic siege that wore at the family's morale in a way none of the larger dangers quite managed. The first 3 days on the beach had left every one of them bitten raw, welts stacked on welts until Finn's ankles, the most exposed and least defended part of a 9-year-old who refused to keep his shoes on, swelled to the point that Elena spent an entire evening applying cool compresses of stream water and quietly worrying, in the specific silent way of a mother trying not to alarm her child, about infection. Zoe's arms bore a constellation of bites she catalogued, with grim humor, in her notebook as though conducting a scientific survey of her own suffering. Even Pack, thin-coated and unbothered by most of the island's discomforts, took to burying himself nose first in sand whenever the insects grew thick at dusk. I've treated snake bites that bothered people less than this, Elena said one evening, watching Finn scratch at a cluster of bites on his shin with a fury that threatened to break the skin. There's something almost insulting about it. We survived a cyclone and now we're being defeated by something the size of a grain of rice. It was Mara, arriving 8 months later with knowledge accumulated over her own 4 solitary months, who finally gave the family real relief, though by then they had already worked out, through trial and considerable error, a partial defense of their own. Caleb discovered, on a foraging trip in the island's marshier interior, a low, aromatic shrub whose crushed leaves, rubbed on exposed skin, seemed to genuinely discourage the insects, a folk remedy he tested first on himself with the specific scientific rigor he brought to everything, comparing bite counts on treated and untreated patches of his own arm over a full week before declaring the results significant enough to share with the family. Marcus wove a crude netting from softened pandanus fiber, coarse and imperfect but enough, hung over the cave's sleeping platform, to cut the worst of the nighttime assault by more than half. Smoke from the evening fire, banked correctly, kept the insects clear of the immediate camp in the hours the family was most often gathered together. Even with every defense they built, the insects never entirely relented, and there were nights, particularly in the weeks following any heavy rain, when standing water pooled in every low fold of the jungle floor, when the whining, constant presence of them at the cave's entrance felt, David admitted in his journal, like its own kind of plague, biblical in scale if not in origin. From the Journal of David Jacobson, entry 23, I found myself thinking tonight of the plagues visited on Egypt, the lice, the flies, the small and undramatic afflictions that Scripture records almost as an afterthought beside the more dramatic ones, the blood and the darkness and the death of the firstborn. I always read those chapters as a boy without much feeling for the lice and the flies specifically. They seemed like the minor plagues, the ones Pharaoh could have simply tolerated his way through if he'd been stubborn enough about the bigger horrors. I don't read them that way anymore. I understand now that a plague doesn't have to be dramatic to be a genuine trial of a person's endurance. Sometimes the small, ceaseless things are the ones that actually test whether you can keep going. We are not being tested by cyclones every day. We are being tested by mosquitoes every single night, and some nights that has felt like the harder test. The family developed, over the following months, a specific and eventually almost fond relationship with. The problem, Finn naming particularly persistent individual mosquitoes with the same enthusiasm he brought to naming lizards, Zoe keeping a running, increasingly absurd tally in her notebook of confirmed casualties, them, at least several thousand, difficult to confirm exact number, Marcus insists on an official count. It became, by the second year, less a crisis than a running joke, one of the island's several ongoing minor indignities that the family had simply learned, the way people eventually learn to live beside any chronic and non-fatal irritation, to fold into the texture of ordinary life rather than continuing to experience as a fresh injury each time. Chapter 9, The Interior and the Cave. It was Caleb who pushed, over 4 days of increasingly organized argument, to explore beyond the beach, first as an observation at dinner. They didn't know what was behind the ridge, then a practical concern. There might be resources they were missing. Then a safety issue, there might be dangers they didn't know about, and finally, exasperated, a flat statement of intent. He was going, with or without permission, and would rather have Marcus with him. David gave in on the 4th night, over a dinner of rice and smoked fish, the smokehouse still months from existing. This fish simply grilled directly over the fire, eaten the same day it was caught, the way all their fish had been eaten so far. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "I just didn't want to say it out loud and make it feel more urgent than it is." "It is urgent," Caleb said, not unkindly. "We don't know what's on this island." "That's not a small thing not to know." They set out at first light the next morning, Marcus and Caleb with the multi-tool, a length of rope, and 2 days of rationed water, David reluctantly agreeing to stay behind with Elena, Zoe, and Finn, a decision that cost him visibly, Elena noted, watching him pace the beach for the better part of that first day, unable to settle into any of his usual tasks. The central ridge rose perhaps 300 meters, not tall by any conventional measure, but a serious proposition from the jungle floor, where old-growth canopy 60 feet overhead gave way to a mid-story of tree ferns and a dense understory laced together by a root system so interwoven the ground itself felt woven. Marcus, who had always privately thought of his quieter younger brother as more suited to books than physical terrain, found himself repeatedly surprised by how naturally Caleb moved through it, reading the slope, finding the path of least resistance through undergrowth that looked, to Marcus's eye, entirely impassable, identifying which vines would bear weight and which would tear free the moment you trusted them. At the summit, a rocky outcropping above the tree line, wind-scoured and bare, the full shape of their situation became visible for the first time. The island was larger than they guessed from the beach, perhaps 6 kilometers long, 2 across at its widest point, shaped roughly like a crescent with a small secondary islet attached at its northern tip by a sandspit visible at low tide. To the east, across a channel of dark blue water perhaps 15 kilometers wide, the dim mass of a larger island rose on the horizon, Toi, Caleb guessed, cross-referencing the salvaged GPS unit's stored charts, though there was no way to be entirely certain. No structures were visible anywhere. No vessels moved on the water in any direction. "It's bigger than I thought," Marcus said, turning slowly to take in the full crescent shape. "I thought we'd walked most of it already." "We've walked maybe a tenth of it," Caleb said. "Maybe less." But it was to the north that the day's discovery waited, behind a limestone outcropping invisible from the beach camp. The ridge fell away into a sheltered valley, and in that valley, unmistakable even from a distance, a dark mouth in the rock face, a small stream emerging at its base. They reached it by early afternoon and spent nearly 2 hours inside, working by the light of David's phone, which Marcus had borrowed for the expedition specifically for this possibility. 3 connected chambers, the innermost dry and cool and tall enough for even David to stand upright in, its floor smooth limestone, worn flat by some geological process neither of them could guess at, its roof pierced by a natural chimney crack that would, they both immediately understood, draw smoke cleanly to the sky rather than filling the chamber with it. The stream, tested cautiously by taste and then, more rigorously, days later with the purification tablets, proved to emerge from an underground aquifer entirely. Separate from and apparently unconnected to any surface contamination. Caleb sat in the cave's inner chamber for a long moment, saying nothing, and Marcus, who had learned, over 18 years of being this particular boy's older brother, to recognize the specific quality of his silences, waited him out. "This is better than anything we've built," Caleb finally said. "It's better than anything we're going to build. We should just live here." "Dad's going to want to look at it himself before he agrees to anything," Marcus said, which was true, and also, both of them understood, largely a formality. They returned to the beach camp that evening with the report, and David listened to Caleb's description: 3 chambers, the innermost dry, the chimney draught, the clean water, with the specific quiet he fell into when he had already, internally, decided something and was giving himself a moment before saying it out loud. If the monsoon comes, Caleb said, finishing, that's where we'd want to be. Marcus had already done the math on the salvaged GPS unit's date display. 2.5 months, he said. Give or take, before the southern Philippines gets the full monsoon. That's not very much time to build a life twice. From the Journal of David Jacobson, entry 17, I told Elena about the cave tonight after the children were asleep. She was quiet a long time. Then she said we should move there before the monsoon. I agreed. Then she said something I've been turning over since. I keep thinking about whether we're being rescued from something, or towards something. I can't tell anymore which direction the rescue is supposed to go. I didn't know how to answer her. I'm still thinking about it. Chapter 10, Building Twice. The month that followed was, by David's private accounting, the hardest physical labor of his adult life, harder, even, than residency's worst stretches, because residency had at least offered the structure of assigned shifts and the promise of eventual rest. Here, the labor simply continued for as long as daylight allowed, 6 days building the beach camp's remaining infrastructure while simultaneously, on the 7th, making the 2-hour trek to the cave to begin preparing it for occupation. They spent April building a proper garden above the tide line, wild yam cuttings and banana shoots that Caleb had spent weeks locating, planted now in real rows, tended with a hope that had, by this point, some actual evidence behind it rather than pure desperation. Elena took primary responsibility for the garden's daily care, a role that surprised her slightly, given that her own childhood in suburban Ohio had involved nothing resembling agriculture, but that she found, to her own quiet satisfaction, she was reasonably good at a kind of patient, incremental tending not entirely unlike the patient, incremental work of raising 4 children. Marcus, restless with a pre-med student's need to be optimizing something, engineered what he called the waterline, bamboo poles, split lengthwise and hollowed into half-pipes, laid downhill from the stream to carry water to the garden without 6 daily trips by hand. It leaked in 4 places on its first test, a failure that visibly stung him until Zoe, watching him stare at the leaking joints with real frustration, offered the observation that would become one of the family's most repeated lines. A leak you know about isn't a failure, he told her. She would later insist he'd said it to himself first and only repeated it to her when she caught him muttering it. It's a diagram. She wrote it down immediately, because it was, she noted in the margin, the most Marcus sentence she had ever heard him produce. The move to the cave, when it finally came in mid-June, took 3 full days of relayed carrying up the ridge trail, every salvaged item, every tool, every scrap of the family's accumulated inventory transported on foot, on shoulders, in makeshift bamboo pole slings, up a trail that had, by the 3rd day, become so familiar that even Finn could navigate its trickier sections without adult guidance. David built a raised sleeping platform from split bamboo, working out the joinery through several failed attempts before arriving at a lashing pattern stable enough to hold 6 sleeping bodies without shifting. Elena organized the cave's interior into the same functional zones: sleep, cook, eat, medical, she had once brought to a kitchen in Portland, except now the shelves were ledges of actual stone, the pantry a series of niches in the limestone wall, the medical corner a flat rock surface where the first aid kit lived under Zoe's daily inventory. The first fire lit in the inner chimney, on the evening of the 3rd day, drew clean and true, smoke pulled straight up and out exactly as the cave's architecture had promised. David watched it rise and, by his own private admission in the journal that night, came closer to weeping over a column of smoke than he had over almost anything in his adult life, not from grief, but from the specific, overwhelming relief of a plan that had actually worked. Chapter 10a, What the Heat Took. It was Elena who collapsed, in early May of the first year, during what should have been an unremarkable afternoon of garden work, the incident that would, in the family's private accounting of that first year, come to mark the day David finally understood that his wife, whose steadiness had anchored all of them since the raft, was not, in fact, inexhaustible. The dry season had settled over the island with a heat that felt different from anything any of them had experienced in Portland's mild, rain-softened climate, a heavy, saturating heat that pressed down through the middle of each day and made even routine tasks feel like labor performed underwater. Elena had been working the garden since early morning, determined to finish transplanting a row of yam cuttings before the worst of the midday sun, skipping, without quite noticing she was doing it, both her mid-morning water break and the wide-brimmed palm leaf hat Caleb had woven for exactly this purpose the week before. Zoe found her sometime past noon, sitting oddly still between the garden rows, her face gone pale beneath her sun-darkened skin, her hands trembling faintly when she tried to lift the digging tool. "Mom?" Zoe said, and when Elena turned to answer, the words came out slurred and slightly wrong, and her eyes seemed to have trouble finding Zoe's face. Zoe would say, months later, that the next 10 minutes were the most frightened she had been since the night of the wreck, running for David, who was working the fish traps a quarter-mile down the beach, her voice cracking as she called for him, and then the specific, awful sight of her father, normally so composed, breaking into a full sprint the moment he understood what Zoe was telling him. David found Elena disoriented, her skin hot and dry rather than sweating, her pulse rapid and thready under his fingers when he checked it, the classic presentation, his medical training told him immediately. Of severe heat exhaustion tipping dangerously close to heat stroke, a diagnosis that filled him with a fear sharper than almost anything he'd felt since the storm, precisely because he understood, with full clinical clarity, exactly how quickly this specific condition could turn fatal. Without rapid intervention. "Get her into the shade, now," he told Marcus, who had come running behind him. "Zoe, I need every container we have filled with stream water, as cool as you can get it, now, don't walk, run." They worked over her for the better part of 2 hours, cool wet cloths against her neck and wrists and the insides of her elbows, small careful sips of water once she was lucid enough to safely swallow, David monitoring her pulse and breathing with the same focused attention he'd once brought to a patient on his own operating table, except that this patient was his wife, and his hands, Marcus noticed, shook very slightly the entire time in a way David's hands never shook during actual surgery. Elena came back to herself gradually, first confused, then frightened by her own confusion, then, once the worst had clearly passed, deeply and audibly embarrassed. "I'm the one who's supposed to catch this before it happens to someone else," she said, her voice still weak, tears standing in her eyes that David understood were as much about the fright of it as the physical depletion. "I've treated a dozen heat stroke cases in the ER. I know every sign. I just didn't think to look for them in myself." "You take care of everyone else's body on this island," David said, sitting beside her in the shade, holding a cool cloth against the back of her neck himself now rather than delegating it. "You have to let someone take care of yours sometimes." "That's not a failure, Elena. That's just what it means to be a person and not a machine." Finn, who had watched most of the crisis from a frightened distance, crept close once his mother was clearly recovering and curled against her side without speaking, and Elena, exhausted as she was, found the strength to wrap an arm around him. David thought, sitting with his family in the shade that afternoon, of a story he had not consciously reached for in years, Elijah, after his great triumph on Mount Carmel, fleeing into the wilderness in a state of complete physical and spiritual collapse, lying down under a juniper tree and asking, in his exhaustion, to simply be allowed to die. He did not tell Elena the comparison outright, sensing it might sound, in the moment, like more weight than she needed to carry. But he thought of the specific tenderness of what happened next in that old story, not a rebuke for the prophet's collapse, not a lecture about resilience, but an angel who came and touched him and said only, gently, "Arise and eat," and let him sleep again after, and fed him a second time before finally saying, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee." From the Journal of David Jacobson, Entry 31, I keep thinking about Elijah under the juniper tree today, watching Elena recover in the shade. The angel didn't tell him to be stronger. The angel fed him and let him sleep, twice, before ever asking him to get up and keep going. I think I have been, without quite admitting it to myself, expecting all of us, Elena most of all, to simply keep being strong indefinitely, as though strength were a fixed resource rather than something that has to be replenished the same way water and food do. I am going to try to be better at noticing when someone in this family needs to be fed and let to sleep before they're asked to be strong again. Starting with my wife. Elena was back on her feet within 2 days, though David insisted, over her mild protest, on a full week of modified work with mandatory shade breaks enforced at specific intervals, a schedule Elena found faintly ridiculous and privately, she admitted to him one evening, deeply grateful for. The garden's yam cuttings, tended that week by Marcus and Caleb in her stead, took root regardless, a small and unremarkable fact that nonetheless struck Elena, watching the first green shoots emerge 10 days later, as its own kind of quiet mercy, proof that the world, and the family, could hold together even in the specific week she had not been strong enough to hold it up herself. Chapter 11, Inventions of Necessity. What the family built across that first year was not survival in the thin, minimal sense of the word, not merely staying alive, but something closer to a homestead, assembled piece by piece from a strict inventory of what the island and the wreck between them provided. Each invention solved a problem and, almost without exception, revealed the next one waiting behind it. The smokehouse came first, in July, built from an idea Elena remembered from her wellness blog years researching food preservation for camping families who would never actually need it for their lives, a fact she found genuinely funny the first time she said it out loud to David. I wrote an entire article about this for people who were never going to use it, and here we are. A rack of green bamboo, suspended over a slow, deliberately smoky fire, kept from open flame by damp coconut husks laid over the coals. Strips of Marcus's daily catch hung to cure for 2 days until they no longer spoiled in the tropical heat within a single afternoon. It meant, for the first time since the wreck, that the family was not eating only what had been caught that same morning, a small mercy that felt, at the time, enormous, and that changed the texture of every subsequent week, since a bad fishing day no longer meant a hungry night. Salt came next, in early August, dug from shallow pits in the tidal flat lined with scavenged fiberglass panel fragments, left to the sun for 3 hot days until a usable crust formed along the pit's edges. David, scraping the first batch into a coconut shell container, pronounced it the single most medieval thing we'd done yet, and meant it, Elena understood, entirely as a compliment, a small, private joke about how far their daily lives had traveled from the world of hospital whiteboards and wellness blogs. Soap followed in late August, a process Elena found genuinely unpleasant to execute, hardwood burned down to ash, water run through it to leach out lye, the caustic result boiled with coconut oil until it thickened into something that was, against all reasonable odds, actual soap. It smelled of wood smoke and coconut, sharp and strange at first, and became, within a matter of weeks, what clean simply meant to all of their brains. A fact Zoe found herself noting with real surprise, that something so recently foreign could become, this fast, the new baseline for an entire sense. Fish traps followed the smokehouse's demand for a steadier supply, woven cages of split bamboo, staked into the reef's tidal channels, checked morning and evening, a technique Marcus worked out through repeated failure and one afternoon of careful, methodical redesign after watching how the reef's natural channels funneled fish at the changing tide. Garden tools followed the garden's growing needs, a fire-hardened bamboo dibber for planting, a hoe blade lashed from a salvaged panel fragment to a bamboo handle, both crude by any hardware store standard and both, in practice, entirely adequate to the task. By September, David had begun teaching Marcus the rudiments of field medicine using a pocket knife and a preserved orange as a stand-in for tissue, the principles of incision, of closure, of what to do when what you have is not what the textbook assumes you'll have. Marcus, in turn, taught Caleb basic fluid dynamics using the waterline itself as a working diagram, the two brothers spending an entire rainy afternoon debugging a persistent leak with an intensity that Elena, watching from the cave entrance, found herself genuinely moved by, not the leak itself, but the specific, absorbed collaboration of two brothers who had, for most of their lives at home, existed in largely separate orbits. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, day 170, we started school today because Mom decided 9 straight days of rain would turn into no school ever if somebody didn't stop it. I'm learning plant taxonomy from Caleb, which is mostly memorizing which vines will make your hands itch. Sin is learning to read tides by ear, which he insists is a real subject, and honestly, on this island, it kind of is. Mom is teaching from memory. She doesn't have any of her old books, so she's reconstructing entire lessons out of things she half remembers from her own school, which she says is making her realize how much of what she learned she actually retained, and how much was just memorized for a test and immediately forgotten. The first monsoon arrived 2 weeks ahead of Caleb's estimate, characteristic, he noted with the specific satisfaction of someone whose predictions were usually right even when the timing was slightly off, of weather in a region that treated meteorological surprise as a form of local hospitality. 9 unbroken days of rain turned the cave's dim interior into the family's entire world, and it was during those days, confined and dependent on each other in a way ordinary life at home had never demanded, that they discovered both the strengths and the friction points of who they actually were together. Marcus and David argued over fuel rationing for the fire, a disagreement that resolved itself, eventually, into the same compromise the earlier signal fire debate had reached, a small fire always burning, fuel reserved for anything larger. Elena and Zoe had a quiet, intense confrontation about Zoe's habit of wandering the jungle alone, which was really an argument about danger that a 14-year-old understood intellectually and disregarded emotionally, the way 14-year-olds reliably do, and that resolved only when Elena, exhausted and frightened in equal measure, finally said, "I am not asking you to stop being brave. I am asking you to be brave with someone," a distinction Zoe found, to her own surprise, that she could actually accept. On the 9th night, with rain roaring through the chimney crack like a cord held too long, Finn asked his father whether God could stop it if he wanted to. David, to his own quiet surprise, answered directly, told his youngest son about a different storm, on a different sea, and a teacher who woke from sleep and said only peace, be still, and how the wind had simply stopped. Did he stop this one? Finn asked. Not yet, David said. But we're still in the boat. That's not nothing. Finn considered this with the gravity he brought to everything and went to sleep against Pack's flank, apparently satisfied, more satisfied, David privately admitted, than he was with his own answer. Chapter 11a, Ghost Stories. It was Marcus, of all of them, who started it, a fact that would become a small, ongoing family joke, since Marcus was, by his own admission, the least likely person in the family to actually believe in anything he couldn't run a controlled experiment on. It happened on a rain-heavy night deep in the first monsoon. The family gathered close around the cave's banked fire with nothing much to do but wait out another hour of downpour, when Marcus, apparently bored past the point of restraint, announced that he was going to tell them about the thing he'd heard 2 nights earlier from the outer chamber. It was probably wind, he admitted immediately, which did nothing to prevent Finn from sitting bolt upright with wide, delighted eyes. But it sounded, very specifically, like someone breathing. Slow. Right at the cave mouth. And then it stopped. That's not a ghost story, that's wind, Zoe said, though she'd also gone very still. I said it was probably wind, Marcus said, with the specific relish of an older brother who had found, quite by accident, an excellent way to entertain a captive audience on a rainy night. I'm just saying it was very specifically shaped wind. What began as Marcus's single invented tale grew, over the following weeks of that first long monsoon, into a genuine family tradition, ghost stories told deliberately at the fire on the rain-heaviest nights, each family member eventually contributing their own. Some borrowed loosely from half-remembered campfire tales from home. Some invented entirely new for the island's specific darkness. Caleb, with characteristic thoroughness, developed an elaborate and genuinely unsettling legend about a fisherman who had drowned on the reef generations before any of them arrived, and still, some nights, could be heard mending nets that no longer existed. A story he delivered with such flat, convincing seriousness that even Marcus, who had started the whole tradition, admitted it gave him a chill. Finn's contributions were considerably less frightening and considerably more beloved, generally involving a friendly ghost named Bartholomew who lived in the cave's third chamber and whose primary supernatural activity was hiding people's socks. A story Finn told with total sincerity and updated regularly with new supposed sightings, until Bartholomew took it became the family's standard explanation for any missing small object, a running joke that outlasted, in the end, even their time on the island. It was Mara, once she joined the family that autumn, who brought stories that carried a different weight entirely, fragments of local Filipino folklore she'd grown up hearing from her own grandmother, told carefully, respectfully, with a specific gravity that made even Marcus's usual skepticism quiet down to listen. She spoke of spirits said to guard particular trees, of the old belief that certain places on an island, a cave mouth, a place where fresh water met salt, were thresholds where the ordinary world thinned, and of the specific etiquette her grandmother had taught her for showing respect to a place before disturbing it, a courtesy Mara admitted she had, half seriously, half out of old habit, continued to practice alone on this island for 4 months before the Jacobsons ever arrived. "Do you actually believe any of it?" Zoe asked her once, the two of them alone at the fire's last embers after everyone else had gone to sleep. Mara considered the question with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "I believe," she said, "that a place this old and this quiet deserves to be spoken to carefully, whether or not anything is listening. That seems true to me whether or not the specific stories are literally true. Maybe that's its own kind of faith. I've never been sure how to describe it more precisely than that." It was Elena who noticed, watching Finn's face during one particularly effective telling of Caleb's drowned fisherman story, that her youngest son had gone from delighted to genuinely, if pleasurably, frightened, and who understood, with the specific instinct of a mother reading a room, that the evening needed, before bed, a different kind of story than the ones being traded around the fire. "Do you want to hear a true one?" she asked him, once the others had wound down and Finn was pressed close against her side, only slightly reluctant to admit he might want the comfort of it. "Is it scary?" Finn asked. "No," Elena said. "It's the opposite of scary. It's about the disciples, out on a boat at night, in the dark, on rough water, much rougher than anything we've been in, even the night of the storm, and they see someone walking toward them across the water, and they're terrified, because who walks on water? It has to be a ghost, it has to be something to be afraid of. And they cry out. And then the person walking toward them says," Elena paused, letting the moment settle, "Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid." "Who was it?" Finn asked, already knowing the answer, wanting to hear her say it anyway. "It was someone they already knew," Elena said. "Someone who loved them." The scary thing turned out to be the safe thing, the whole time, the second they were able to see clearly what it actually was. "I think that's true more often than we give it credit for, Finn." "Not always. But more often than people think." Finn considered this with the specific gravity he brought to everything, glanced once toward the cave's dark outer chamber where Marcus's original, probably just wind-breathing sound had supposedly originated, and then, apparently satisfied, closed his eyes against his mother's side and was asleep within minutes, leaving Elena to sit a while longer by the fire's last light, thinking about fear, and its frequent habit of turning out, on closer and calmer inspection, to be something else entirely. Chapter 11b, The Night It All Came Out. It happened to Zoe, in the end, on a night in late September of the first year, not dramatically, not as a single identifiable breaking point, but as the slow accumulation of 11 months finally overtopping whatever quiet, private dam she had been holding it behind. She had been, by any outside measure, the family member managing the island best, her notebook a model of steady, controlled observation, her contributions to every project competent and largely uncomplaining. It was, Elena would say later, precisely that steadiness that had let everyone else, herself included, fail to notice how much Zoe had been carrying without ever setting any of it down. It started with something small, a fishing net Caleb had asked her to help mend, a knot she couldn't get right after 3 attempts, an ordinary small frustration that should not, by any reasonable accounting, have produced what it produced. Zoe threw the net down, and then, to her own visible shock as much as anyone else's, began to cry, not the controlled, dignified crying she generally allowed herself, but something rawer and less managed, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in the specific broken rhythm of someone who had been holding something in for a very long time and has simply run out of room to keep holding it. "I can't do this anymore," she said, when Elena reached her, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had finally given. "I can't keep being the one who writes everything down like it's all fine, like I have some kind of distance from it, when I don't. I'm just as scared as everyone else. I'm scared all the time. I miss my friends. I miss my room. I miss not having to think about whether we have enough water every single day of my life. And I don't get to say any of that because I'm supposed to be the one who's keeping the record, not the one who's falling apart." Elena did not try to fix the words with other words. She simply sat down in the sand beside her daughter and pulled her in, and let Zoe cry into her shoulder for as long as Zoe needed to, not offering reassurance yet, not offering perspective, just presence, the same instinct, refined over 11 years in an emergency department, that had taught her that a person in genuine distress needs, first and before anything else, simply to not be alone in it. David arrived partway through, drawn by the sound, and did not intervene either, understanding without being told that this was not a moment for fixing. He sat a little apart, close enough to be present, far enough to let Elena hold the space she was already holding, and it was several minutes before Zoe, her crying finally slowing, noticed him there and, wordlessly, reached one arm out toward him too, pulling him into the same embrace. "You don't have to be the record keeper every single minute," Elena finally said, once Zoe's breathing had steadied. "You're allowed to just be a 14-year-old who's scared sometimes. That's not a failure of the job. That's just what's true, underneath the job, the whole time. We all knew that. We should have said it to you sooner." "I didn't want anyone to worry about me on top of everything else," Zoe said, quieter now, spent. "Everyone already has so much to worry about." "That's exactly backward," David said. "The people who love you don't need you to protect them from your own hard feelings. That's not protection. That's just isolation with a nicer name." He thought, sitting there with his daughter and wife in the dark, of a line from the Psalms that Elena had read aloud once, months earlier, that had stayed with him more than he'd expected it to at the time. "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved." He had understood the verse, when Elena first read it, as being about faith in a fairly abstract sense. He understood it now, watching his daughter finally set down a weight she had been silently carrying for nearly a year, as something much more concrete, that a burden carried alone, indefinitely, was not a form of strength but a form of slow damage, and that the actual practice of faith, at least in a family, often looked exactly like this. One person finally admitting she could not hold something by herself, and 2 other people simply staying, without flinching, to help hold it instead. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, 3 days later, "I haven't written anything since the night I fell apart at the fishing net, which is the longest gap in this notebook since we got here. I think that's fine. I think some things are allowed to happen before they get written down instead of being written down. Mom and Dad didn't try to talk me out of being sad. They just stayed. I didn't know that was a thing you were allowed to ask for until I accidentally asked for it by falling apart in the sand. I'm going to try to ask for it on purpose next time, before it gets to the falling apart part. I make no promises about how well that will go. Marcus and Caleb, told about the evening the next morning in gentler terms by Elena, made a point, over the following weeks, of checking in on Zoe with a specific new attentiveness, Marcus taking to occasionally, unprompted, asking her directly how she was actually doing rather than assuming her competence meant she didn't need asking. Caleb simply sitting beside her at the fire some evenings without requiring conversation, a presence Zoe found, to her surprise, more comforting than words would have been. Finn, told only that his sister had had a hard day, brought her a shell he'd found that he considered especially good, and said nothing else about it, which Zoe would later say was possibly the most perfectly calibrated response anyone offered her the entire week. Chapter 11c, What They Carved for Fun. It was Elena who first insisted, sometime in the long, wet stretch of the first monsoon, that the family needed something to do in the evenings that was not chores, not lessons, not the maintenance of survival, something that existed purely because it was enjoyable, with no practical output required at all. We are at genuine risk, she announced one particularly rain-heavy evening, with the specific mock seriousness she used when she meant something quite seriously indeed, of forgetting how to have fun for its own sake. I would like to address this before it becomes a permanent condition. Caleb produced, within 2 days, the first of what would become an entire small industry of carved game pieces, a set of smooth, flat stones gathered from the streambed, sorted by size and color into 2 matched sets of a dozen each, accompanied by a board Marcus scratched into a section of the cave's smoothest limestone floor with the point of the multi-tool, a simple grid, 6 pits to a side, that turned out, once Mara examined it, to closely resemble a version of Mancala, a game she'd played as a child with her own grandmother using nothing more than a shallow dish and dried beans. You've basically reinvented an actual game, she told Caleb, genuinely impressed. People have been playing something almost exactly like this for thousands of years, all over the world, usually with whatever stones or seeds happen to be lying around. You didn't even know that, and you built almost exactly the same thing. Maybe there's only so many good ideas for a 2-person stone game, Caleb said, and everybody eventually finds their way to the same ones. The Mancala board became a nightly fixture, tournaments developing over subsequent weeks with a seriousness the family found genuinely funny to observe in themselves, Marcus in particular developing an intense, closely guarded strategy he refused to fully explain even under direct questioning, Finn playing with a chaotic enthusiasm that occasionally, infuriatingly for his more methodical siblings, won anyway through what could only be described as beginner's luck operating at an almost supernatural level. Zoe, whose contribution leaned toward the verbal rather than the physical, began, that same monsoon, running a nightly ritual she called simply the worst thing, in which each family member was required to offer up the single worst or most embarrassing small thing that had happened to them that day, delivered for maximum comic effect, judged by informal but enthusiastic acclaim. Finn's entries were reliably the most delighted, often involving some fresh indignity visited on him by a crab or a particularly uncooperative coconut. David's were usually self-deprecating accounts of some minor engineering failure. Elena's, delivered dryly, were often about the specific comedy of trying to maintain any domestic standards whatsoever in a cave. The worst thing that happened to me today, Marcus announced one evening, with the specific gravity of a man about to deliver genuinely tragic news, is that I have now personally verified, through repeated experimentation, that there is no way to eat a smoked fish with dignity. None. I have tried every angle. It cannot be done. That's not new information, Zoe said. That's just Tuesday. It bears repeating, Marcus said. For the historical record. Finn's own most significant carving contribution arrived a few weeks into the tradition, a set of small wooden figures, whittled with more enthusiasm than skill from scraps of soft driftwood, that he insisted represented each member of the family plus pack, and that he used to act out increasingly elaborate stories at the fire's edge some evenings, his own private theater that the rest of the family, once they realized what he was doing, took to quietly and appreciatively observing rather than interrupting. The Finn figure, notably, was always given the starring role and the most dramatic dialogue, a piece of narrative self-casting nobody in the family had the heart to point out or correct. Caleb, beyond the Mancala board, carved a full set of dice from a dense hardwood offcut over several patient weeks, genuinely cube-shaped, genuinely balanced, a level of craftsmanship that impressed even David, who asked, only half-joking, whether his son had missed his true calling. They were pressed into service for a dice game Mara taught them, a simplified version of something she remembered from university dormitory nights. And for an increasingly baroque set of house rules the family layered on top of it over successive months until the finished game bore only passing resemblance to whatever Mara had originally described. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, sometime during the second monsoon, Mom was right, all those months ago, about needing something that wasn't chores. I don't think I understood at the time how important that would turn out to be. It's easy to survive together. It's a different, harder thing to actually enjoy each other, on purpose, on a regular schedule, especially when you're tired and scared underneath most days whether you say so or not. The Mancala board and Dad's terrible jokes and Marcus's tragic fish opinions might honestly be as important as the waterline. I wouldn't have believed that a year ago. I believe it now. There is a verse Elena likes to quote, on the evenings the games ran especially long and especially loud, about how a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, while a broken spirit drives the bones, and she said it, more than once, not as a lesson but simply as an observation, watching her children laugh too hard at a game that had started, less than a year earlier, as nothing more than smooth stones and a line scratched into rock. I used to think that verse was about mood, she told David once, watching Finn attempt an increasingly theatrical victory dance after an improbable Mancala win. I think now it might actually be about medicine. Literally. I think laughing together, on purpose, regularly, might be doing something for all of us that the smoked fish and the clean water can't do by themselves. Chapter 12, Mara. Pat had been ranging north for 4 days, returning each time in a state of specific agitation. Caleb had learned to read, bright-eyed, unusually vocal, circling back to Caleb himself as if trying, in the only language available to him, to communicate something urgent, before Caleb finally followed. 40 minutes over a secondary ridge brought him to a stretch of northern coastline the family had mapped from the summit but never visited, and there, on the beach below, a driftwood and thatched shelter, a fire pit, a rack of drying fish, and a woman with her back to them, mending a net. He did not approach immediately. He watched from the tree line for several minutes, the way he had learned to watch the island's animals, still, patient, taking in details before acting. A cleared garden patch. Stacked coconut husks for fuel. A bamboo smoking rack, clearly the work of someone who had solved the same problem the Jacobsons had only recently solved themselves. A handheld radio propped against a piece of driftwood, its screen dark. He returned to the cave that evening with the report, delivered with his characteristic care, not there's a woman on the north shore, but a careful accounting of every detail he'd observed, as though presenting evidence rather than news. Marcus insisted on accompanying him the next day, and David, after a long conversation with Elena that night about risk and caution and the specific vulnerability of approaching an unknown person on an island where anything might have happened to her, agreed. They found the woman still there the next afternoon, still mending the net. Marcus stepped on a branch. She was on her feet before the echo faded, a bamboo pole raised, her eyes reading the tree line with the alert stillness of someone who had learned, in this exact place, that surprises were never casual. Are you from the ship? She asked, in English so fluent it was nearly accentless, before switching, catching herself, to rapid Tagalog and then back again when she saw their faces clearly weren't following. Which ship? Marcus managed. There are two. She lowered the pole slowly, though her eyes stayed sharp. Her name was Mara Santos, 27, a marine biologist from the University of the Philippines Visayas, alone on the island since the previous December, nearly 4 months before the Jacobsons had even arrived. She had survived the sinking of her research vessel in an early-season storm, the details of which she gave only in brief, controlled fragments over that first conversation, a night crossing, equipment failure, a scramble for a single life raft that had not, in the end, held all of her colleagues. How many of you got off? Marcus asked, and immediately regretted the question when her expression flickered. Just me, she said, and did not elaborate further, and Marcus, 18 years old but perceptive enough to recognize a door closing, did not ask again. She had built, in 4 months of solitary and increasingly expert improvisation, a working knowledge of the island's resources that made the family's own understanding look, by comparison, like a rough first sketch. She knew the tidal windows that would double their fishing yield, information she offered within the first hour of meeting them with a generosity that surprised Marcus, who had half expected, he admitted this to Zoe later, slightly ashamed of the assumption, that 4 months alone might have made her guarded about sharing hard-won knowledge. She knew which plants on the interior slope carried antimicrobial properties that could treat the low-grade fungal infections that had been plaguing everyone's feet for months. A problem she diagnosed within minutes of walking the family's cave and noticing Zoe favoring one foot. And she had built, alone, from salvaged wire and copper fittings scavenged from her own wrecked research vessel, a half-wave dipole antenna, strung from a coconut palm, that would, once connected to the Jacobsons' nearly dead VHF radio, extend its range by a factor that in open ocean conditions meant the difference between being heard and simply broadcasting into silence. You built that yourself? David asked, examining the antenna's construction with something close to awe, the specific respect of one methodical person recognizing another. I had a lot of time, Mara said, which was, David understood, both a simple factual answer and an entire unspoken account of 4 months alone that none of them were yet entitled to hear in full. They charged the family's radio over 2 days using her salvaged solar panel, then carried it to the summit, connected the antenna, and David read their coordinates into the International Distress Channel with the careful diction of a man who had waited 223 days for exactly this moment. They received a response within the hour, brief, staticky, a Philippine Coast Guard relay station logging the transmission without yet being able to confirm or dispatch a vessel. It was not rescue. But it was, for the first time in over 7 months, proof that the signal existed somewhere beyond their own island, that someone, somewhere, had heard them. Elena wept when the response crackled through, not from disappointment that it wasn't yet an actual rescue, but from the simple, overwhelming fact of a human voice, bureaucratic, static-laced, entirely unmoved by the significance of the moment on the other end, confirming that the world they'd been shouting into for 7 months had, in fact, been listening. From the Journal of David Jacobson, entry 59, I've been thinking about what Mara said at dinner tonight, after the contact. She'd been alone 4 months, and she told me the hardest part wasn't the practical difficulty. The hunger, the labor, the weather. It was the silence of not matching to anyone. I kept a journal, she said, because writing made me feel witnessed. Like someone was reading over my shoulder. I told her I'd kept one too. She asked what it was for. I said I wasn't entirely sure. She said, maybe it's the same reason. Wanting to be seen. Even by yourself. Mara moved into the cave's outer chamber within the week, not as a guest exactly but as what she quickly became, a 7th member of a 6-person family, teaching Elena to weave on a loom she built from salvaged fiber and driftwood over the following months, teaching Caleb reef fishing techniques that tripled his daily catch within weeks, teaching Finn, almost by accident, more about marine biology than any classroom in Portland ever would have. There was, in the family's collective memory of that autumn, a specific and rapid warmth to how quickly Mara's presence stopped feeling like an addition and started feeling like a fact, the seventh chair at the fire that no one remembered having needed to add. Zoe, in particular, attached herself to Mara with an eagerness that surprised even Zoe, the specific hunger of a 14-year-old for a woman who was neither her mother nor a peer, someone whose competence and independence offered a model of adulthood distinct from anything Zoe had previously had access to. Mara, for her part, seemed to recognize something of her own younger self in Zoe's precise, watchful note-taking, and began, without ever formally offering to, correcting Zoe's plant sketches and adding scientific names in the margins in a neat, careful hand that Zoe would, months later, describe as one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen someone do for her. Chapter 12a, Mara's Library. Of the 6 books Mara Santos had salvaged from her own wrecked research vessel and carried, wrapped in oilcloth, through 4 months of solitary survival before the Jacobsons ever arrived, 3 would come to matter to the family out of all proportion to their size. She had taken them, she admitted, half by accident, grabbing an armful from the research vessel's small common library in the frantic minutes before her own boat went down, with no time to choose carefully, only to grab and run. A field guide to Indo-Pacific reef fish. A dog-eared Tagalog-English dictionary. And, inexplicably, wonderfully, a single water-stained paperback anthology titled 3 Castaway Classics, containing, in full, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and Johann David Weiss's The Swiss Family Robinson, 3 centuries-old accounts of shipwreck and survival that Mara had bought secondhand in a Manila bookstall years earlier and never quite finished, and that now, absurdly, constituted a third of the family's entire library. I used to read a page or 2 some nights, Mara told them, the evening she first produced it from her shelter's dry stores, when I couldn't sleep. It felt strange, at first. Reading about a man surviving alone on an island while I was surviving alone on an island. Then it stopped feeling strange and started feeling like company. David turned the paperback over in his hands with something close to reverence. We had 4 phones with a downloaded Wikipedia article between us, he said. You had an actual survival library. I think you did better than we did. They began reading aloud that same week, a new ritual folded into the evenings around the fire, Elena reading a chapter of Robinson Crusoe one night, David the next, Mara often taking Gulliver's Lilliput chapters, her English precise and unhurried, giving each of Swift's satirical set pieces its full comic weight. Finn, predictably, loved Gulliver best, delighted beyond measure by the image of a giant tied down by an entire nation of 6-inch people, and spent an afternoon attempting, with Marcus's amused cooperation, to stake Pack to the sand with a network of miniature ropes in imitation, an experiment Pack tolerated for almost 4 minutes before simply standing up and walking away with the entire apparatus still attached, to Finn's very great delight. Caleb was quieter about his preference, but Zoe noticed, over the following weeks, that he kept circling back to the Swiss Family Robinson, the family in that novel, like their own, cataloging an island's resources with a naturalist's patient thoroughness, building and inventing their way toward a life rather than merely enduring one. It's basically a very old field journal with a plot stapled to it, Caleb said, only half joking, and began, without announcing it, modeling the format of his own notebook more deliberately after it, dated observations, careful sketches, a running inventory of what the island offered a family willing to look closely enough. It was Elena, reading Robinson Crusoe aloud one evening in their 2nd month at the cave, who stopped mid-page, struck by a line that felt, she said, uncomfortably close to something she'd been thinking herself. She read it to the fire, her voice steady. How strange a checkerwork of Providence is the life of man, and by what secret differing springs are the affections hurried about, as differing circumstances present. She set the book down in her lap for a moment. That's exactly it, she said. That's exactly the thing I haven't had words for. What thing? Zoe asked. That I don't know anymore whether this happened to us or for us, Elena said. Crusoe didn't know either. 300 years ago, and he still didn't know. I find that oddly comforting. It means it's not a question you're supposed to be able to answer. It's just a question you're supposed to keep asking. Zoe wrote the exchange down that night, and beneath it, in smaller handwriting, added her own note. I looked up checker work later, when we had the dictionary out for something else. It just means a pattern made of alternating squares, like a chessboard. Good and bad, next to each other, over and over, making a pattern you can't see clearly until you're far enough away from it. I think that might be the best description of the last year I've read anywhere, including everything I've written myself. David, for his part, found himself drawn back again and again to Crusoe's own journal keeping, the specific, methodical inventory taking that Crusoe applied to his wrecked ship's supplies, a habit David recognized, with a small shock of recognition, as nearly identical to his own first morning on this island's beach, item by item, counting what remained. He mentioned this to Elena one night, slightly embarrassed by the comparison. I thought I was inventing that, he said. Taking inventory like that. Turns out I was just doing what people have always done when the world falls out from under them. There's something steadying in that. In not being the first person to need a list. Gulliver's Travels, meanwhile, became Marcus's unlikely favorite, though not for the satire that had captivated Finn. Marcus found himself returning to the sections on the Helens, the rational horses whose entire society was organized around reason and plain necessity rather than the vanities and ambitions Gulliver observed everywhere else in his travels. I keep thinking about how much of what we used to worry about at home doesn't exist here, Marcus said one evening, closing the book after reading a chapter aloud. Not because we solved it. Because it was never actually necessary in the first place. It just took losing everything to see which worries were real and which ones were just furniture. The book made its way, in the following months, into nearly every corner of the family's island life, Finn quoting Gulliver's Lilliputians at inconvenient moments with great comic timing. Caleb's notebook entries growing steadily more Weiss-influenced in their careful, patient cataloging, David and Elena returning, again and again through the 2 years that followed, to Crusoe's plain, dogged persistence as a kind of permission slip for their own. It was, Zoe wrote near the end of their second year, strange and wonderful that 3 books written across 3 different centuries, by 3 men who could never have imagined an island quite like this one or a family quite like theirs, had turned out to have already said, in their own way, nearly everything the Jacobsons needed to hear. Chapter 12b, What the Reef Contained. Caleb's cataloging of the island's marine life, begun in earnest once Mara's field guide gave his observations a proper vocabulary to work with, grew over the 2 years into something closer to genuine scientific documentation than casual curiosity, a fact his eventual graduate advisor would later confirm, reading his notebooks, with something approaching disbelief at their rigor. The reef running along the island's southern face proved to be part of the same extraordinary marine ecosystem Mara had studied professionally before her own shipwreck, an outlying arm of the Coral Triangle's biodiversity, the same warm, current-fed waters that made the Sulu Sea, despite its remoteness, one of the richest fishing and diving grounds on Earth. Caleb documented, over 2 years, hawksbill and green sea turtles nesting on the island's quieter northern beaches in numbers that Mara confirmed were consistent with regionally significant nesting sites. Finn's fascination with sea turtles, which had begun with a printed life jacket on the raft, deepening over 2 years into a genuine and detailed knowledge that rivaled his older brother's plant taxonomy. Thresher sharks, distinctive for their extraordinarily long, whip-like tail fins used to stun prey, appeared periodically in the deeper water beyond the reef's drop-off, a species, Mara told them, famous in diving circles at certain other sites in the region for gathering at predictable cleaning stations, though the Jacobsons' own island reef never offered quite that spectacle, only occasional distant sightings from the second chance that left Finn breathless with excitement each time. Manta rays passed through in the plankton-rich weeks following the monsoon, gliding through the shallows with a slow, unhurried grace that even Marcus, generally more focused on what the reef could provide for dinner than what it offered to simply watch, admitted, stopping his handline to observe. Small pods of dugongs, gentle, slow-moving marine mammals that graze on seagrass meadows and that Mara identified as among the most endangered species in Philippine waters, were spotted only twice in 2 years, both times at dawn, both times by Caleb, who considered each sighting significant enough to merit its own dedicated notebook page complete with sketches and estimated size and behavior notes he cross-referenced obsessively against Mara's field guide. "You know, most people never see one of these in their whole life," Mara told him, after the second sighting, examining his careful sketch. "Even people who study them for a living." "I get why," Caleb said. "They don't want to be seen. That's most of what I've learned out here, honestly. The things worth seeing mostly don't want to be found. You just have to be patient enough, and quiet enough, and they're often enough, that eventually they forget to hide from you." The reef's abundance was, David reflected privately, the single factual explanation for why the family had survived at all with the relative ease they had. A less generous reef, a less biodiverse stretch of ocean, might have left them perpetually hungry rather than merely working hard for adequate meals. He found himself, without any professional obligation to do so, developing something like a layman's expertise in reef ecology purely from 2 years of dependence on it, able to read tidal patterns and fish behavior with an intuition that surprised him each time he successfully predicted where Marcus's traps would be fullest. It was this same reef, and the deep, current-swept channel beyond its southern edge, that Mara would later explain had made their particular stretch of the Sulu Sea attractive to more than fishermen and researchers. A natural deep-water passage close to shore, she pointed out, was exactly the kind of feature that made an island useful to vessels wanting to move quickly and unseen between open water and a temporary hiding place. The same biological richness that fed the family, in other words, had also quietly made their home valuable to people with much less peaceable purposes. Chapter 13, First Christmas, First Year. By Christmas, decorated with a young palm strung in shells and the small white flowers that grew near the stream, a real tree being simply unavailable and nobody missing it as much as they'd have expected to, Mara sat at the family's fire as though she had always been there, and the family agreed, without discussing it, that she had earned exactly that. The day itself unfolded with a specific, deliberate ceremony that Elena had been planning, in her head, for weeks. Not because Christmas required elaborate observance, but because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, how much the ritual itself mattered now that so many of their old rituals had been stripped away. Marcus had spent 3 days carving thin a slingshot from forked driftwood and the length of the raft salvaged bungee cord, working on it in secret during his fishing hours, and presented it with a formality that made Finn's eyes go wide. Caleb had been collecting, over the preceding weeks, the specific shells that caught morning light best, and had strung them along the young palm with an eye for composition that Zoe, watching him work, recognized as the same attentiveness he brought to everything else. David read the Christmas story from memory that evening, since they had no Bible among their salvaged belongings, and got 2 verses wrong in a way that made Elena correct him without looking up from the fire. A small domestic moment that struck several of them, independently, as more moving than a perfect recitation would have been, proof that this was still, at its core, an ordinary family doing an ordinary thing, however extraordinary the circumstances around it. Gifts this year, Zoe wrote that night, by cost, nothing. By what they mean, everything I have to compare them to. Chapter 14, 1 Year. By the 1-year mark, in mid-March, the inventory of what they had built had grown long enough that Zoe devoted an entire notebook entry to simply listing it, sitting at the cave's mouth with her pencil for the better part of an hour, determined not to let a single accomplishment go unrecorded. From Zoe Jacobson's notebook, day 365, a year. I want to write down everything we've built so I don't forget, because already some of it feels like it was always here and I know that isn't true. We built a shelter, then a better shelter, then moved to a cave and made that better too. A water line from stream to garden. A smokehouse. A salt pan. Soap. A signal fire platform that can go from nothing to a column of black smoke in under 4 minutes, Marcus timed. A garden that actually produces instead of just existing. Fish traps that mean Marcus doesn't have to catch every single meal with a handline anymore. And, this year, thanks to Mara, a loom with real cloth coming off it, which doesn't sound like a lot until you remember that a year ago none of us could have told you what a shuttle was. Finn turned 10 in February. He does not remember, when I asked him gently to check, exactly what an iPad was for. I'm choosing to find that funny and not sad. David marked the anniversary privately, walking the beach alone at dawn before anyone else woke, turning over in his mind the specific strangeness of having now spent a full year of his life in a place he had never intended to visit and could not, on any map available to him, precisely name. He thought of his patients back in Portland, the surgeries rescheduled, the residents who would have finished their rotations without him, the whole machinery of his old life continuing to turn without his hand on it. He found, examining the thought, that it produced less grief than he expected. He was surprised by how much less. Elena marked it by leading, that evening, the longest and most deliberate prayer of thanksgiving the family had yet held together, not the bargaining, frightened prayer of the raft, but something steadier, more examined, a full accounting of a year's specific mercies rather than a plea for one more. Zoe, listening, did not say amen at the end, the same private omission she'd noted on the first night in the raft. But she noticed, writing about it later, that the omission felt different now, less like doubt and more like a specific, private kind of attention she wasn't yet ready to name as faith but could no longer honestly call its absence either. Chapter 14a, What Wouldn't Float. The dugout canoe that Marcus and Mara would eventually build, in the competent spring of the second year, was not the family's first attempt at getting off the beach and onto open water. It was, in fact, their fourth, and the 3 failures that preceded it had consumed the better part of 8 frustrating months, scattered across the tail end of the first year and the first months of the second, each one teaching the family something it hadn't known it needed to learn. The first attempt came in September of the first year, not long after Mara's arrival, born from a straightforward and, it seemed at the time, entirely reasonable idea, lashed together a raft of the straightest, most buoyant bamboo poles they could cut, wide enough to hold 2 people, simple enough to build in an afternoon. Marcus and Caleb built it exactly that fast, pleased with themselves, and carried it down to the water with a small ceremony Finn insisted on, complete with a shell necklace draped over the bow that he declared, with total seriousness, was for good luck. It floated for approximately 4 minutes before the individual poles, lashed but not truly bonded, began working independently of one another under the stress of the first real swell, the whole structure flexing and separating with an alarming grinding sound until Marcus, standing in water now up to his knees on what had recently been a solid deck, called the experiment off before it became a rescue situation of its own. The problem, Marcus announced at dinner that night, with the specific wounded dignity of a person whose confident plan has just publicly failed, is that bamboo poles want to move independently. We need something that's one piece. Or lashed so tight it behaves like one piece. The second attempt, in November, addressed exactly that lesson and introduced a new failure entirely. Working from a diagram David half remembered from an illustrated children's encyclopedia of his own childhood, they built a coracle, a round, bowl-shaped frame of bent green bamboo, stretched over with a covering of the family's remaining raft fabric, waterproofed as best they could manage with a mixture of tree resin and coconut oil that Elena spent 2 full days rendering down over the fire. It looked, Zoe wrote in her notebook, genuinely like a real boat, for the first time, which is somehow the most exciting and the most nerve-wracking part. It held together admirably. It also, once loaded with even a single person's weight, proved nearly impossible to control, spinning in slow, dizzying circles the moment it left the shallows, entirely at the mercy of current and wind, with no keel or directional structure of any kind to resist the spin. Caleb, the first to test it, paddled with increasing and eventually comic desperation for nearly 10 minutes without making any net progress whatsoever in any single direction, drifting steadily further from shore while rotating the entire time, to the point that Marcus had to swim out and tow him back in, both of them laughing too hard by the end to properly finish the rescue with any dignity. "It's a boat that goes in every direction at once," Finn observed, watching from the beach, delighted. "That's actually kind of amazing, if you don't need to go anywhere specific." "We need to go somewhere specific," David said, though he was laughing too. The third attempt, in February of the second year, tried to solve the coracle's directional problem by building something closer to a proper hull, a narrow frame construction, ribbed like the illustrations in David's remembered encyclopedia, skinned in a more careful and elaborate application of fabric and resin that took nearly 3 weeks to complete. It was, by any measure, their most ambitious and most carefully engineered attempt yet, and its failure, when it came, was correspondingly more disheartening. The resin seal, adequate on the coracle's simpler curved surface, cracked along the narrow hull's tighter joints and seams. Within its first week of use, and no amount of patching kept pace with the leaks that kept opening in new places as fast as the old ones were sealed. "A leak you know about isn't a failure, it's a diagram," Zoe reminded Marcus, quoting his own line back to him with the specific relish of a younger sister who had been waiting 8 months for the perfect opportunity to deploy it. "There are currently 11 diagrams in this boat," Marcus said, examining the hull's latest failure point with real frustration. "I would like considerably fewer diagrams." It was Mara, that same month, who finally offered the insight that broke the impasse, not a new technique exactly, but a reorientation of the whole problem. "You keep trying to build something and then make it waterproof afterward," she said, examining the wreckage of the third attempt with the family gathered around it in a mood closer to defeat than any previous failure had produced. "What if you built something that didn't need to be waterproofed at all? Something that was solid wood, all the way through, with nothing to seal because there's nothing to leak." "A dugout," David said slowly, understanding arriving with the specific relief of a puzzle's missing piece finally sliding into place. "A dugout," Mara confirmed. "It's slower to build. It's more work, up front. But once it's finished. There's no seam to fail 6 months later." The fourth attempt, begun the following month with a fallen hardwood log Caleb had been eyeing for weeks without knowing why, succeeded, not because it was clever in a way the previous 3 hadn't been, but because it was, finally, the right kind of solution for the specific problem the island actually presented, arrived at only after 8 months of increasingly informed failure had eliminated every plausible alternative. From the Journal of David Jacobson, Entry 84, "I keep thinking about Noah tonight, of all of people, watching Marcus and Mara char and scrape at the dugout by firelight. Not the flood itself, the sheer duration of the building, which scripture mostly skips past in a handful of verses, as though the actual carpentry weren't the point. 100 years, some traditions say, of a man building something enormous and impractical looking with no visible proof yet that the water was actually coming, just the instruction, and the wood, and presumably a great many boards that didn't fit right the first time he cut them. I don't think scripture skips the failed attempts because they didn't happen. I think it skips them because they aren't the part of the story that matters most. The part that matters is that he kept building. We capsized a raft, spun in useless circles in a coracle, and patched 11 diagrams into a hole that leaked faster than we could seal it. None of that made it into the version of this story I'll probably tell people once we're home. But I think, honestly, that it's the actual middle of the story, not the parts on either side of it." Marcus, for his part, kept the coracle's collapsed frame propped in a corner of the cave's outer chamber for the rest of their time on the island, half as a joke, half, he admitted once, as a genuine reminder, that the family's eventual competence at nearly everything they'd built had never once arrived on the first attempt, and that remembering the failures honestly seemed, to him, more useful in the long run than only remembering the successes. Chapter 15, The Second Year Begins. The second year did not feel any of them agreed later, like a continuation of the first so much as a different country entirely, the country of people who now knew what they were doing. The dugout canoe consumed most of that second spring, a fallen hardwood log, hollowed by controlled fire and the patient scraping of the one good saw, char and scrape, for the better part of 3 weeks, under the joint and frequently theatrical supervision of Marcus and Mara, who argued about hole shape with the specific intensity of two people who were not married but sounded, by April, exactly as though they might be. The beam's too narrow, Marcus said, for perhaps the fourth time that week, standing over the half-hollowed log with his arms crossed. It'll roll the second we put any real weight in it. It's supposed to be narrow, Mara said, not looking up from the section she was charring. Narrow cuts through swell. Wide catches it broadside and rolls worse. You're thinking about a rowboat. This isn't a rowboat. I did a semester of naval architecture as an elective, Marcus said. I've actually built one of these before, Mara said, which ended the argument, as it generally did, in her favor. Caleb carved an outrigger arm from a curved branch he'd been saving for weeks, specifically selected for a natural bend that would keep the finished hull from rolling in open swell, a detail he'd apparently understood intuitively before either Marcus or Mara had finished arguing about it. A fact Zoe found herself quietly delighted by and noted in her journal with the specific glee of a younger sibling watching an older one be shown up. The canoe floated on its first test, and briefly did not float on its second, with Marcus in it, 40 feet offshore, to the enormous and uncontainable amusement of the entire beach, Finn laughing so hard he had to sit down in the sand, Elena laughing despite herself, even David, watching his eldest son swim the swamped canoe back to shore with as much dignity as the situation allowed, unable to keep a straight face. They named her the Second Chance, Finn's idea, on the theory that she was their second boat, a piece of logic the rest of the family declined, out of affection, to correct, though David privately thought the name carried a weight Finn hadn't consciously intended and never told him so. The canoe changed the island's available geography in ways that mattered more than any of them initially anticipated. Reef zones that had been unreachable by waiting were suddenly fishing grounds, doubling the family's catch within the first month. The eastern coastline, jagged with limestone and previously avoided on foot, could now be surveyed from the water, a capability that would, within a few months, prove more consequential than anyone paddling the Second Chance on that first triumphant, capsizing test run could have guessed. Chapter 16, Second Monsoon, School, and the Sundial. The second monsoon, arriving that June, felt entirely different from the first, not easier, exactly, since the rain cared nothing for experience, but met by a family that no longer needed to ask each other whether they'd survive it. On the fourth day, Finn simply announced, "This is a boat week," a phrase whose logic took Elena a moment to parse, a callback, she eventually realized, to David's story about the storm on the sea, applied now with a child's flexible, practical logic to any stretch of confining weather, and it became, from that point on, the family's private name for it. A proper school corner was built into the cave that same month, a flat stone slab for a desk, a box of dry sand for Finn to trace letters in when paper ran short, a shelf holding the 2 books that had survived the wreck and the 6 Mara had salvaged from her own camp. Mara taught marine biology in the afternoons with an enthusiasm that succeeded, to everyone's mild astonishment, in holding a 10-year-old's full attention for an hour at a stretch. Nothing, it turned out, captured Finn quite like being told there existed a fish that could change its own sex partway through its life, a fact he repeated to every member of the family individually, several times each, over the following week, with undiminished delight each time. Elena taught mornings, reconstructing lessons on history and literature and basic mathematics from memory with an ingenuity that surprised her, she found, teaching Zoe algebra using pebbles and sand-traced diagrams, that she remembered far more of her own decade-old schooling than she'd have guessed, and that the act of teaching it clarified her own understanding in ways that felt, unexpectedly, like a gift rather than a burden. August brought Caleb's sundial, a flat summit stone, a bamboo gnomon set true north by 2 nights of star sighting, its hour marks scratched and cross-checked against the one watch that still ran, David's, wound each night with the private ceremony of a man keeping faith with a smaller kind of time. Alongside it came a proper calendar, a cord of knots, one per day, a colored knot marking the first of each month, replacing the family's original habit of counting days only since the wreck. Caleb had been the one to point out, quietly, one evening at the fire, that counting days since a disaster, forever, was its own kind of trap. Better, he argued, to count days towards something. Finn's birthday. The garden's next harvest. Whatever came next, whatever it turned out to be. You've thought about this a lot, Elena said to him, watching him tie the first knot of the new system. I think about a lot of things, Caleb said, which was everyone in the family understood by now, simply true, and required no further explanation. Chapter 16a, The Overnight. It was Elena's idea, in the end, though she would later credit Caleb with the practical case that convinced David, a proper family expedition, an overnight camping trip away from the cave, to the island's far northern point. The small tidal islet connected to the main island only at low water, a place none of them had visited in the 18 months since the family's arrival despite Caleb's repeated, quietly persistent requests to survey it properly. We've spent 2 years building a life here, Elena said, making her case at dinner one evening in the second year's early autumn. I don't want us to look back and realize we never once, in all that time, went somewhere just to see it. Not to fish it, not to garden it, not to defend it. Just to see it. They went the following week, timed carefully around the tide charts Caleb now kept with genuine expertise, Elena, David, and Caleb, with Mara staying behind at the cave with Marcus, Zoe, and Finn on a rotation that would swap the following month for a second trip. They carried a light kit, water, smoked fish, a section of raft fabric for shelter, the compass, and, at Finn's insistent request delivered as they left, something to remember it by, which turned out to mean David's small waterproof notebook, pressed into Caleb's hands specifically so the trip could be properly documented for those who'd missed it. The walk north took most of the day, following the ridge trail past the observation post, quiet now, its watch reduced to a weekly check rather than the constant vigilance of the previous autumn, and down through unfamiliar terrain on the island's less explored eastern flank, terrain Caleb had glimpsed from the summit many times but never actually walked. They crossed the tidal sandspit at the exact low-water window Caleb had calculated, watching the channel that would, in 6 hours, be waist-deep water, currently exposed as a narrow ribbon of wet sand connecting the main island to its smaller northern companion. The islet itself was barely a quarter mile across, thick with a different character of vegetation than the main island, lower, scrubbier, wind-shaped, offering views in every direction that the main island's taller jungle canopy never permitted. They made camp at its highest point as the light went gold, and David, sitting with his wife and second son watching the sun drop toward a horizon with no land anywhere in sight beyond their own island's silhouette to the south, found himself thinking of the ancient instruction given to a wandering people, camped and moving, for 40 years in a wilderness that must have felt, on its worst days, exactly this vast and exactly this indifferent to their smallness within it. I keep thinking about the Israelites, he said, mostly to himself, watching Elena unpack the smoked fish for their dinner. Camped wherever the clouds stopped. Moving again wherever it moved. No permanent home for 40 years, and somehow, I don't know, somehow it wasn't only a punishment. There's this line, I think it's in Exodus. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud, to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire, to give them light. I used to read that and think about how frightening it must have been, not knowing where you'd sleep next. Sitting here, I think I understand it a little differently. There's something almost enviable about a life organized entirely around simply following what's actually in front of you, one day at a time, rather than around a plan you made years in advance and now have to defend. Is that what we've been doing? Caleb asked. Following the cloud? I think so, David said. I don't know that I would have called it that a year ago. I think I would have said we were surviving. I think now I'd say we were being led somewhere, one manageable day at a time, and it just happened to look, from the inside, exactly like survival. They slept that night under the open sky. Rather than the raft fabric shelter, the night warm and clear enough that none of them wanted the shelter's cover between themselves and the stars, a canopy of them, dense and close in a way Portland's light pollution had never once permitted any of them to see at home. The Milky Way, a visible pale river directly overhead. Caleb, predictably, spent an hour before sleep identifying constellations aloud with the same patient thoroughness he brought to bird skulls and reef fish, and Elena, lying between her husband and her son, found herself struck by a specific and unexpected peace, the whole family, in her mind, present even in the ones who'd stayed behind at the cave, held together across distance by nothing more than the fact of loving each other enough to have built, without ever discussing it as a plan, a life where that love was the organizing principle of every single day. They returned the following afternoon with Caleb's notebook filled with new bird sightings, a small collection of unusually shaped shells for Finn, and a settled, contented tiredness that Elena would say, months later, made that overnight trip one of her clearest and happiest memories of the entire 2 years. Proof, she said, that a family could build joy for its own sake even in the middle of genuine hardship. That joy did not have to wait for hardship to be fully resolved before it was allowed to exist. The second trip, the following month, took Marcus, Zoe, and Finn to the same islet, and produced, among Finn's other enthusiastic reports on their return, the observation, delivered with total seriousness, that Bartholomew the sock-stealing ghost apparently had a cousin who lived on the islet and specialized in hiding interesting shells instead, a piece of family mythology that would persist, retold with increasing elaboration, for the remainder of their time on the island and well beyond it. Chapter 16b, The Squall. It came without the days of warning the monsoon always granted them, a fast-moving tropical squall in November of the second year, distinct from the seasonal monsoon in both its suddenness and its violence, the kind of storm Mara warned them, once it had passed, could form and strike within hours rather than the days of visible build-up the monsoon always offered. Marcus was out on the reef in the second chance when the sky changed, the light going from ordinary tropical brightness to a strange, greenish dimness within the space of 20 minutes, the wind rising fast enough that he felt it shift against his face before he'd even registered, consciously, that something was wrong. He made the decision that likely saved him, abandoning the fish trap he'd been checking and paddling hard for shore rather than trying to finish the task first, a choice that cost him the trap and gained him perhaps 4 critical minutes. He made the beach as the first heavy rain arrived, the second chance nearly swamped in the surf's sudden violence, and ran for the cave with Caleb, who had seen the sky change from the ridge and come down to help, both of them soaked through and breathing hard by the time they reached the others. The squall lasted barely 90 minutes, but its ferocity in that short window exceeded, David judged afterward, even the worst hours of the original cyclone in terms of sheer wind force, if not duration. A fact that unsettled all of them more than the danger's brevity might have suggested it should, precisely because it demonstrated how little warning the island could sometimes offer before real danger arrived. The garden took significant damage, several rows of banana shoots flattened beyond recovery, the waterline's careful joints stressed and partially dislodged by a falling branch that came down across it at the height of the wind. The signal fire platform on the summit, exposed on the ridge with no jungle cover to break the wind's force, was partially dismantled, its reserve fuel pile scattered across the exposed rock. They spent the following 3 days in repair, Marcus and Caleb rebuilding the waterline's damaged section, David and Elena assessing and salvaging what remained of the garden, Zoe and Finn gathering the scattered signal fuel back into its proper storage. It was, David reflected, writing about it that week, a strange kind of second education after the relative confidence of 18 months accumulated competence, a reminder that competence did not equal invulnerability, that the island retained, no matter how well they had learned to live on it, a capacity to surprise them that they should not allow themselves to forget. From the Journal of David Jacobson, undated, I found myself thinking, in the middle of the squall, of Job, not the famous whirlwind speech near the end, which I've read many times and always found somewhat difficult to fully absorb, all that grandeur about the foundations of the earth and the storehouses of the snow. I thought instead of the earlier chapters, before any of the speeches, where the text simply says that a great wind came from the wilderness and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell. No explanation offered in that moment. No lesson yet extracted. Just the wind, and the house, and the falling. I think that's closer to what these 2 years have actually taught me about disaster than any of the more eloquent passages. Sometimes there is no speech from the whirlwind. Sometimes there's just the wind, and what it takes, and the work of rebuilding what's left standing afterward. The meaning, if there is one, comes later, if it comes at all. You don't get to wait for it before you start rebuilding. The signal platform was rebuilt within the week, reinforced this time with additional bracing Marcus engineered specifically to better withstand sudden wind loading rather than only the sustained but more predictable force of the monsoon, one more small, hard-won improvement added to 2 years of accumulating them, born. As most of the family's inventions had been, directly out of a specific failure rather than out of any theoretical anticipation of what might go wrong. Chapter 16c, What the Storm Uncovered. It was Finn, 3 days after the squall, who found it, wandering the beach in the storm's aftermath with the specific purposeless attention he brought to most of his exploring, kicking through drifts of storm-tossed debris and sand that the squall's unusual wave action had piled higher and further up the shore than any tide the family had witnessed in 2 years. He came running back to the cave holding something in both hands with the particular careful urgency of a child who has found something he instinctively understands is important without yet being able to say why. It was a coin, heavy, dark with age and seawater corrosion, but unmistakably a coin, its surface, once Elena carefully cleaned it with a soft cloth and fresh water, revealing the ghost of an old design, a crowned shield, a partially legible date, lettering in Spanish that Mara, examining it closely, identified within minutes. This is old, she said. Colonial era. Spanish. This could be 300 years old, maybe more. She turned it over carefully in her palm. The Sulu Sultanate traded with, and fought against, Spanish colonial shipping for centuries in these waters. There were wrecks. There are still wrecks nobody's ever found, all through this archipelago. This could be from any one of them, washed loose by the squall from wherever it's been sitting for a few hundred years. Finn's discovery prompted, over the following days, an excited and increasingly thorough search of the same stretch of beach, Finn and Caleb spending hours combing the sand the squall had disturbed, and their patience was rewarded, 3 more coins, badly corroded, and a small, tarnished fragment of what might once have been an ornamental buckle or fitting, its original purpose no longer identifiable. We found treasure, Finn announced at dinner that night, holding all 4 coins in his cupped hands with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight that made even Marcus, generally the most practically minded of the siblings, smile. Actual treasure. Like a real pirate island. It might genuinely be worth something, Marcus said, examining one of the coins himself. To a collector. To a museum, maybe, if it's old enough and rare enough. David turned the largest coin over in his own hand for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, it was with the specific thoughtfulness he brought to questions that mattered more than their surface suggested. I keep thinking of a parable, he said. The one about the treasure hidden in a field, a man finds it, and he's so overjoyed that he goes and sells everything he has, just to be able to buy that field and claim the treasure properly. I always understood that story as being about the kingdom of heaven, about how much a person should be willing to give up for something of real, ultimate value. I wonder tonight if it's also, a little bit, about how strange it is what people are willing to trade for gold. Sell everything he has, for treasure. I keep thinking about that boat we found on the eastern shore last spring. What people are willing to risk, what people are willing to become, for exactly this, for metal that used to matter to somebody, once, a long time ago, and doesn't feed anyone, and doesn't keep anyone warm, and doesn't actually build anything at all. So it's bad? Finn asked, his delight dimming slightly, clutching the coins a little more protectively. No, David said, and put a hand on his son's shoulder. It's wonderful, actually. I think it's wonderful precisely because none of us actually need it. We're not going to trade our family's safety to keep it, the way whoever lost that boat on the eastern shore was clearly willing to. We get to just enjoy it, as a genuinely amazing thing you found, without it costing us anything at all. That's rare. I think that might be the actual treasure, getting to hold something valuable without it demanding anything from you in return. Zoe wrote about the coins at length that night, cataloging each one with the same careful precision she brought to every entry, and added, at the bottom of the page, a line she would return to and underline months later, back in Portland, rereading her old notebooks. Dad's right that it's not really about the coins. But I'm still keeping mine. Some things get to just be treasure, plain and simple, without needing a bigger lesson attached. I think that's allowed too. The coins were eventually surrendered, along with a full account of where and how they'd been found, to Philippine Cultural Heritage authorities in the weeks following the family's rescue, a decision David and Elena made together, over the children's mild but ultimately good-humored protest, on the understanding that whatever ship those coins had come from likely belonged, in some meaningful sense, to a history much larger than any one family's brief and lucky discovery of its scattered remains. Finn was permitted, as a small consolation his parents felt was entirely fair, to keep the least valuable of the four, a request the processing officer in Bongal, hearing the whole story, approved without hesitation, and that Finn kept, from that day on, in the same pocket where he'd once carried a slingshot, a small dense weight he liked to hold sometimes, he said, when he wanted to remember exactly how the island had felt. Part 4, The Corridor. Chapter 17, The Cove on the Eastern Shore. It was Marcus and Mara, out in the second chance on a supply run along the eastern coastline in late April of the second year, who first noticed something wrong about a stretch of shore they'd previously only glimpsed from the ridge above. A shape, pulled up into a narrow, low-tide-only cove and deliberately covered with cut palm fronds, in a way that nothing drifting ashore naturally would ever be arranged, the fronds too evenly layered, too clearly the work of hands rather than tied. That's not driftwood, Mara said, easing the canoe closer, her voice dropping into a register Marcus hadn't heard from her before, careful and low. Could be an old fishing boat, Marcus said, though even as he said it he understood he didn't believe it. They did not investigate that day. Mara insisted on turning back, citing the tide window closing and, more pointedly, a preference for approaching anything unexplained on the island with David present rather than the two of them alone. But Marcus mentioned it to his father that night, at the fire, in the careful, flattened voice he'd learned, over nearly 2 years, meant he was worried and trying not to show it. Probably nothing, Marcus said. Probably just some old fishing skiff somebody abandoned years ago. Probably, David agreed, and neither of them believed the word, and both noticed the other not believing it, and neither said anything further that night. They returned 3 days later, David, Marcus, and Mara, timing the approach for the low tide that would expose the cove's narrow entrance. The boat beneath the palm fronds was small, 20 feet of fiberglass, its long shaft outboard engine clearly beyond any repair the island could offer, not merely broken but stripped, David noted, examining it, in a way that suggested someone had already taken what parts were salvageable before abandoning the rest. Inside the hull, water bottles gone brittle with sun exposure, food wrappers with printing in both English and Bahasa Malaysia, a satellite phone with a cracked screen that Marcus turned over in his hands with the specific care of someone examining evidence rather than salvage, and a sealed plastic container that Mara, standing very still beside the boat, identified before anyone had touched it. I found this 2 weeks ago, she said. On my own. I didn't tell you because I wanted to be sure what it was before I said anything that would scare everyone. And now you're sure, David said. Now I'm sure. She opened it. Sealed packages, wrapped and taped, of something neither man needed a name for once they saw it, layered and careful, professional rows that spoke to an operation far more organized than a single desperate boat's crew. The people who owned this boat were not researchers, Mara said, her voice dropping into a register none of them had heard from her before, careful and precise in the way of someone choosing each word deliberately. Not fishermen. I should have told you the first week I found this. I'm sorry I didn't. David felt something cold settle in his chest, not panic, not yet, but the specific, clarifying dread of a man recognizing that a problem he'd assumed solved was, in fact, not solved at all. Tell me now, he said. All of it. Chapter 18, What Mara Knew. They sat on the rocks above the cove while Mara told them what 4 months of solitary survival, before the Jacobsons ever arrived, had taught her about the waters surrounding their island, knowledge she had, David understood as she spoke, been quietly carrying and quietly deciding, week by week, not yet to share, weighing the value of the family's peace of mind against the value of their preparedness, and only now, with the evidence undeniable in front of them, finally settling that balance. The other way. She had watched other vessels pass in the night, over her original 4 months alone and the 18 months since, dark shapes running without lights, always heading toward the uninhabited fringe islands to the southwest or the Borneo coast to the northeast, moving with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with fishing or research or any legitimate use of open water at 2 in the morning. The Sulu Sea, she explained, was a known corridor, had been for years before she'd ever arrived here, for narcotics moving between the Philippines and Malaysia and beyond, an illegal economy that cared nothing for shipping lanes or distress frequencies, that cared only about not being seen. I used to hear the engines at night, she said. In my first months here, alone, I would hear them and just freeze. Not knowing if they were coming for me, or just passing. I built my shelter further back from the shore after the second time I heard one slow down near the coast. I never told you that either. I didn't want to give you something to be afraid of that I couldn't also give you a solution for. And now? Marcus asked. Do you have a solution now? Now I have information, Mara said. That's not the same thing. But it's a start. The abandoned boat, she explained, meant its crew had broken down here, been forced to leave equipment behind including cargo they clearly hadn't wanted to abandon, and had either been retrieved by another vessel in the corridor's informal network or were still out there somewhere, trying to solve the same problem the Jacobsons themselves had once faced on a smaller scale, how to get off an island that did not want to let you go quietly. They know this island exists, Mara said. It's a waypoint. Somewhere to break down, to hide, to wait for retrieval. They could come back for salvage. For fuel. For anything they left behind that's still worth something to them. David stood and walked a few steps along the rocks, needing the motion, needing somewhere to put the specific restlessness that had risen in him since Mara opened the container. He thought of Finn, asleep in the cave 2 hours walk from where he now stood, of the specific vulnerability of a 9-year-old, 10 now, he corrected himself, time moved strangely out here, asleep in a home whose location every member of this family had spent 2 years making as visible as possible to the outside world, for exactly the opposite reason they now needed. We built a life here designed to be found, he said, mostly to himself. Every fire, every signal. 2 years of trying to be seen. And now the thing we most need is to not be. Chapter 18a, What the Sea Had Always Carried. Mara, explaining what she knew of the corridor running past their island, offered the family more than just her own 18 months of observation. She had studied, during her university years, the region's maritime history as background for her marine biology fieldwork, and what she told them that night, sitting on the rocks above the abandoned smuggler's boat, gave the family's fear a context that made it feel, David said later, less like an isolated nightmare and more like an old and recurring pattern they had simply stepped into partway through its telling. The Sulu Sea, she explained, had been a corridor for centuries before any of them were born, the historic seat of the Sulu Sultanate, whose maritime traders and, at various points in its long history, raiders had controlled these waters from the 15th century through the 19th, moving goods and people across exactly the same routes the dark, unlit vessel had used the night it searched their beach. Spanish colonial campaigns had spent decades trying and largely failing to fully suppress the sea's long tradition of unregulated maritime movement. More than a century later, contemporary reporting Mara had read before her own shipwreck confirmed that piracy and smuggling remained active concerns in these waters, a continuity that unsettled her more, she admitted, than any single frightening night ever could. It's not really about us, she told the family. That's the strange comfort in it, if there is one. This isn't a story about us being unlucky enough to end up somewhere dangerous. It's a story about a very old road that happens to run past a very small island, and we happen to be standing on the island when someone was using the road. Does that make it better or worse? Zoe asked. Knowing it's not personal? Mara considered the question with real seriousness before answering. Better, I think. A person can be reasoned with, sometimes, or avoided, or fought, if it comes to that. A road can't be argued with. You just have to know where it runs, and build your life somewhere it doesn't have to notice you. David thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way he turned over the black stone he would eventually carry off the island in his pocket, the specific, unsettling comfort of understanding that the danger surrounding his family was ancient and impersonal rather than something they had somehow invited through any failure of their own. It did not make the watch rotation any less exhausting. But it changed, subtly, how he explained it to Finn on the nights his youngest son needed reassurance. Not someone is trying to find us, but there is an old road nearby, and we have gotten very good at living quietly beside it. Chapter 19, What They Decided. The family gathered that night in the cave's inner chamber, and David told them what he knew, choosing his words with the specific care of a surgeon delivering a diagnosis rather than a verdict, direct, unflinching, but not needlessly frightening beyond what the facts required. Elena listened in silence, one hand resting on Finn's head, her face carefully neutral in the way David recognized from her years, the specific professional calm she deployed when the situation demanded steadiness more than emotion. Caleb said nothing throughout, which from Caleb meant he was processing at full capacity, his eyes moving between his father and the cave's entrance as though already, mentally, mapping escape routes. Zoe held her carpenter's pencil still against the page and did not write anything down, which was, in its own way, more alarming to David than if she had. Are we going to have to fight them? Finn asked. He had overheard more of the earlier conversation than intended, drifting close to the fire under the cover of pretending to play with Pac, and asked the question now with the flat directness only a 10-year-old could manage. David crossed the cave and crouched down to Finn's level, an instinct from 25 years of delivering difficult news to frightened people, adult and child alike. No, he said. We are going to keep doing exactly what we've been doing for 2 years. We are going to be careful, and we are going to be smart, and if they come back, we are going to make sure they never know we're here at all. How do you hide a whole family? Zoe asked. We're not exactly small. There's 7 of us and a dog. Carefully, David said. And with a plan. Which is what we're going to spend tonight making. It was Marcus, characteristically, who turned the family's fear into a workable structure within the hour, sketching options on the back of a spare chart page with the same intensity he'd once brought to exam preparation. They would not abandon the homestead, 2 years of work, the shelter, the garden, the waterline, represented a survival margin none of them were willing to surrender to a hypothetical, unconfirmed threat. But they would build, quietly and without fanfare, a second layer of preparedness on top of the first. An observation post, Marcus said, tapping the ridge on the chart above the eastern cove. Somewhere with a clear line of sight down to that stretch of coast, concealed, staffed in rotation. If anything comes back, we see it long before it sees us. I can build that, Caleb said immediately. There's a rock formation above the cove with natural cover. I noticed it when we went out there. I didn't think about why at the time. A route, Mara added. From the beach camp to the cave, that we can run blind, at night, without light, without noise. We already have the trail. We need to actually practice it as an evacuation, not just a hike. And decoys, as Caleb said, after a moment, his voice quieter but no less certain. If they ever do come close enough that we need to actually disappear, not just watch from a distance, we need the island to still look occupied somewhere they're not looking at us. Fires along stretches of coast far from both the cave and the main camp. Something to hold their attention if it ever comes to that. David looked around the fire at his family, at Marcus, already sketching a rotation schedule, at Caleb, describing terrain features with the same fluency he'd once used for bird migration patterns, at Zoe, finally writing again, her pencil moving fast, at Elena, watching Finn with the specific fierce attention of a mother calculating, silently, every possible danger and every possible protection against it, at Mara, who had carried this knowledge alone for weeks rather than let it disturb A. Peace she'd clearly come to value as much as any of them, and felt, beneath the fear, something that surprised him, a kind of pride so sharp it was almost indistinguishable from grief. We're not going to provoke anyone, David said, closing the conversation. We are going to become very good at being somewhere else. Chapter 20, The Watch. For 6 weeks, the family's new preparations settled into the same disciplined rhythm as everything else they built, practiced, refined, gradually absorbed into the texture of ordinary island life rather than remaining a constant, exhausting vigilance. The observation post, once Caleb finished it, proved almost invisible even to someone who knew exactly where to look, a shallow depression in the rock above the eastern cove, screened by natural scrub, offering a clear sightline down to the water while remaining, from below, indistinguishable from any other fold in the limestone. The watch rotation fell to Marcus, Caleb, and Mara primarily, with David filling in when needed and Elena keeping Finn and Zoe occupied with garden work and lessons during the hours the others were posted. A division of labor nobody formally assigned but that emerged, within days, as the sensible arrangement, given Elena's instinct to keep the two youngest as far from the actual risk as the small island reasonably allowed. The evacuation route was practiced twice that first week, once in daylight and once, more critically, in full darkness, Marcus leading, counting paces aloud under his breath in a habit he'd developed to keep track of the trail's turns without needing light. Elena directly behind Finn with both hands ready to guide him, Zoe and Caleb bringing up the rear, pack silent throughout, having absorbed, over 2 years, an uncanny sensitivity to the family's collective mood that meant he required no command to stay quiet when quiet was needed. You did great, Elena told Finn, after the second practice run, both of them slightly out of breath at the cave's mouth in the dark. You didn't even need me to hold your hand for the last part. I still like you holding it, Finn said. Just so you know. Even if I don't need it. I'll always hold it, Elena said, and meant it in a way that went well beyond the trail. Finn's 10th birthday, celebrated, as birthdays now were, with an entire smoked fish set aside just for him, an offering he received with a gravity that struck Elena, watching him, as genuinely moved rather than merely polite, arrived and passed during this uneasy, watchful autumn, a small bright fixed point of ordinary joy set against the family's newly heightened alertness. David noted, in his journal that week, a specific and strange gratitude for the island's insistence on continuing to produce ordinary happiness even now, the garden's harvest coming in regardless of who might or might not be watching the coastline. Finn's delight in his birthday fish entirely unaffected by his father's private, carefully hidden fear. Then, on a clear evening in late September, the watch on the ridge Caleb, that night, 3 hours into a routine shift he'd expected, like the previous 41 shifts before it, to produce nothing, saw a shape on the water. Low and dark, running without lights, moving along the eastern coast on a course that would bring it directly past the cove where the abandoned boat still sat, half visible beneath its cover of increasingly weathered palm fronds. Chapter 21, The Boat in the Dark. Caleb did not run for the cave immediately. He had rehearsed exactly this scenario too many times, in his own mind if not in physical drill, to panic through it now. He watched for a full 2 minutes, confirming the vessel's course, its speed, the absence of any running lights that would mark it as a legitimate fishing or patrol boat, before lighting the ridge's smallest signal, not the great column reserved for passing aircraft, but a low, controlled fire meant only to be visible from the family's own camp below, 3 short pulses of smoke rather than a continuous column, the agreed signal Marcus had drilled into everyone weeks earlier. Someone is here. Get to the cave, do it now. The signal reached the beach camp within minutes. Elena, who had been finishing the evening's cooking with Finn beside her, felt her whole body go cold at the sight of the 3 distinct smoke pulses against the darkening sky, and moved with a speed and precision that surprised even her, banking the cooking fire instantly to nothing, gathering the emergency kit that had, for 6 weeks now, sat pre-packed and ready by the shelter's entrance for exactly this moment, taking Finn's hand. Is it them? Finn asked, his voice tight but controlled. The months of practice runs clearly steadying him even now. We don't know yet, Elena said. We're going to the cave. That's the plan. We're following the plan. By the time the dark vessel slowed off the eastern cove, some 40 minutes later, the Jacobson family and Mara Santos were already gone from the beach, up the ridge trail in the dark. By memory and rehearsal, Finn's hand locked in Elena's, pack silent at Finn's heel because even the dog, over 2 years, had learned when noise was not permitted. Marcus brought up the rear with David, both of them pausing twice to look back at the beach camp receding below, the low, banked fire the only sign of habitation left visible, deliberately so, exactly as the family had planned, a camp that would read, to any casual observer, as recently but not currently occupied. From the cave's outer chamber, its own fire banked to nothing, they could see, faintly, lights moving on the water far below, a boat searching, methodically, along the shoreline where their beach camp's low fire still smoldered, untended now, exactly as it should look. Exactly as it always looked in the hours before dawn when the family's watch fire simply burned down on its own. Nobody in the cave spoke. Elena held Finn against her, one hand covering his ear closest to her chest as though she could somehow shield him from the sound of his own heartbeat, which felt, in the silence, deafeningly loud. Zoe sat pressed against Caleb, her carpenter's pencil forgotten in her pocket for once, watching the distant lights with an intensity that would, months later, produce one of the longest and most carefully written entries in her entire notebook. Mara sat closest to the cave's entrance, watching with the specific stillness of someone who had spent 4 months alone learning exactly how to make herself invisible, her hand resting, without anyone commenting on it, on the handle of the machete they used for garden work. The searchlight found the shelter. It found the garden. It lingered on both for a long, terrible minute that no one in the cave breathed through easily, David counting seconds silently, the way he counted seconds during a difficult surgical step, needing the numbers to hold his mind steady against the alternative, which was simply raw fear. Then, because there was nothing there to alarm anyone, no visible bodies, no visible confrontation, only the unremarkable evidence of a camp that could belong to fishermen or castaways or no one currently home, the light moved on. The boat idled another 10 minutes off the eastern cove, engine low, evidently confirming that whatever they'd come for to salvage, cargo, the abandoned boat itself, was either gone or not worth the risk of a closer approach in the dark. Then, without explanation any of them would ever learn, it turned back out to open water and did not return. They stayed in the cave until full daylight confirmed the water empty in every direction, David making the confirming trip to the observation post himself before allowing anyone to consider the immediate danger past. Nobody spoke much on the walk back down to the beach camp. Elena held Finn's hand the entire way, though he no longer needed the support of it, and none of them suggested she let go. From the journal of David Jacobson, undated, written the following night, I keep returning to a plain fact. Nothing we built in 2 years, not the shelter, not the garden, not the signal fire we spent 2 years perfecting, was the thing that saved us tonight. What saved us was the one thing we built that we hoped we'd never need, a way to disappear. I don't know what to make of a homestead whose final, best invention is its own vanishing act. I suspect I'll be thinking about that for a long time after we leave here, however we eventually leave. Chapter 22, The Long Wait. The boat did not return that autumn, or that winter. The family kept the watch rotation regardless, Marcus insisted, and no one argued, though the shifts gradually lengthened in interval as the weeks accumulated without further sign of the vessel, the ridge post becoming, by December, one more item of island infrastructure maintained out of discipline rather than daily fear. There was, David noted privately, a specific psychological cost to the 6 weeks that had followed the encounter, not dramatic, not the sort of trauma that announced itself, but a low, persistent watchfulness that took real effort to set back down. Zoe found herself, for the first time since the earliest weeks after the wreck, sleeping poorly, waking at small sounds that had never troubled her before. Finn, characteristically, processed it through play. Elena found him one afternoon in October reenacting the entire evacuation with a set of shells standing in for family members, narrating the drill to himself with total seriousness, and understood it as exactly the kind of mastery through repetition that had always been how her youngest son made sense of anything frightening. By the family's second Christmas, celebrated with the same young palm, decorated now with real expertise, Mara arriving with specially smoked fish and a woven mat for each of them, the best gift, by any measure, anyone had given anyone in the family in 2 years. The autumn sphere had settled into something more like a permanent, quiet awareness rather than an active dread. The watch continued. The garden was harvested. Finn's 11th birthday, in February, was marked with the now traditional entire smoked fish, received with the same gravity as always. It was Marcus who noticed, examining the abandoned boat on one of his periodic checks of the eastern cove that spring, that it had finally been reclaimed, not by its original owners, but by the sea itself, the hull finally breached by 2 years of tidal wear, its remaining contents long since removed by David and Marcus and turned over, in careful detail, to the Philippine Coast Guard the moment they were finally rescued. The corridor, Mara told them once, likely still ran somewhere out past their island's horizon, indifferent to whether anyone watched for it or not. But their particular island, it seemed, had stopped being useful to it, and the watch, by unspoken agreement, was gradually allowed to relax into something closer to ordinary vigilance. The same alertness any family living on an isolated coastline might reasonably maintain, rather than the specific, sharpened fear of that September night. Part 5. The Rescue and the Return. Chapter 23. Every Ship is Data. Spring wore into a second summer settled into routine. The watchfulness of the previous autumn folded gradually back into the family's ordinary rhythms. April brought the sight of a real ship on the horizon for the first time in 8 months, distant, moving west, not toward them, and Marcus lit the summit signal within his practiced 4 minutes out of pure discipline, though the ship never turned. David told the family, that night, that every ship they saw was data, proof the shipping lane was real, proof they were not as invisible as 2 years sometimes made it feel. He was not certain, writing it in his journal afterward, whether he believed the sentence as fully as he'd delivered it. He wrote it down anyway, on the theory that some sentences become truer the more times you insist on them. Zoe, watching the ship recede that evening from the summit beside her father, asked him something she'd apparently been turning over for a while. Do you ever think about what we'll be like when we go back? Like, actually be like. Not just older. David considered this for a long moment before answering, the specific care he now brought to Zoe's questions a habit 2 years in the making. I think, he said finally, that we'll be people who know what a day actually costs. I don't know how that translates back into a world with grocery stores and Wi-Fi. I suspect it will, in ways I can't predict yet. I don't want to lose it, Zoe said. Whatever it is. I don't want to go back and just become who I was before. You won't, David said. You can't. That's not how it works. The question isn't whether you'll change back. It's what you'll build instead, with whoever you've become. Zoe wrote the exchange down that night, nearly word for word, in an entry she would return to many times over the following year, both on the island and, eventually, off it. Chapter 24, The Cutter. The Philippine Coast Guard cutter BRP Lapu-Lapu appeared on the eastern horizon at 6:47 in the morning, on what Zoe's knotted calendar cord would later confirm as the 793rd day since the Celestia went down, a figure that meant, worked out in ordinary units, 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. It was Caleb who saw it first, as he had seen the island itself first, 2 years and 1 lifetime earlier, a white shape resolving out of gray-pink dawn light into the unmistakable silhouette of a government vessel, its running lights still on in the diminishing dark, its bow cutting a clean white line through the Sulu Sea's morning calm. He was on the ridge for what had become, by that point, a largely ceremonial watch shift, more habit than necessity, and for a long moment he simply stood and stared, unable, even with 2 years of preparation for exactly this possibility, to fully process that the moment had actually arrived. He said nothing when he reached the cave at a dead run. He simply put his hand on Finn's shoulder and pointed east, and that was enough. Within a minute, all 7 of them, the 6 Jacobsons and Mara Santos, with Pack circling at their heels sensing the sudden charged energy without understanding its source, were moving down the ridge trail at a run toward the beach, the same trail they had walked in careful, rehearsed silence 8 months earlier for an entirely different reason, now covered in a burst of unrestrained noise and motion that felt, too. All of them, like its own kind of release. The cutter had come, they would learn over the following days, not by accident but by design, a maritime radio operator in Zamboanga, monitoring the distress frequencies out of long habit rather than any specific expectation, had logged and eventually cross-referenced a week, repeated VHF transmission, one of dozens the family had sent over 2 years, most into apparent silence, with survey reports of unusual, sustained smoke activity from an island the charts listed only as unnamed Sulu. Group B7. 2 mornings of confirmed smoke from the same coordinates, spotted by a routine maritime patrol flight, had been enough to dispatch a vessel to check. On instinct, more than anything else. The whole rescue, in the end, had come down to one operator's instinct to cross-reference 2 unrelated pieces of information that anyone else might reasonably have let pass separately. Lieutenant Commander Anissa Reyes came ashore in the Coast Guard Zodiac and stood on the beach looking, for a long moment, at everything the family had built, the shelter and its evolved successor visible up the ridge line, the garden terraced and productive, the smokehouse, the water line running down from the stream, the loom shed Mara and Elena had built together the previous spring, the second chance pulled up on the sand with her outrigger still lashed tight. You built all of this, she asked. 2 years? My family did, David said, giving the credit away, as he always did, before anyone could think to hand it to him. Elena stood beside him with tears running down her face in 2 silent, straight lines, the way she cried when she was too full for noise. Marcus stood very straight, in the particular posture Caleb recognized as his older brother's method of not visibly collapsing. Zoe had her carpenter's pencil behind her ear and her waterproof chart, 2.5 years of entries deep now, tucked under one arm, unable, in the moment, to think of a single sentence adequate to what she was witnessing. A rare and specific silencing for someone who had spent 2 years finding words for everything. Finn wore, as he had for the better part of 2 years whenever the situation called for it, his sea turtle life jacket. On the theory, he explained to Lieutenant Commander Reyes without being asked, that a ship might come and he intended to be ready. "Is that your dog?" she asked him, consulting a manifest that had never once included Pack. "His name is Pacific," Finn said. "He comes with us." There was a pause. Reyes looked at her clipboard, then at the dog, then at the family behind him, then, finally, at her own supervising officer standing a few paces back, who gave the smallest possible nod. "I will see what I can do," she said, and it was, in the end, entirely resolved in Pack's favor before the Zodiac even reached the cutter, a piece of bureaucratic flexibility that would, months later, become one of the family's favorite stories to tell. The specific image of an armed government vessel's paperwork being quietly amended to accommodate one very determined 10-year-old and his dog. Chapter 25. What was left behind. The leaving was harder than any of them had expected, David most of all, a man who had spent 2 years managing the ache of rescue with disciplined pragmatism, and who found, walking the beach for the last time, that something released cleanly inside him. The way a held knot finally gives. They had not merely survived here. They had become something here, made legible in each of them by 2 years of exact demand, Marcus's care, sharpened into something he intended to carry into a career, Caleb's vision, already half a scientist's, Zoe's voice, discovered on the pages of a notebook she would, within the year, turn into her first published piece, Finn's pure, unreserved engagement with the world, protected rather than diminished by 2 years without a screen, Elena's unbreakable, quiet center, and in David himself. A father who had finally learned to be as present to his family as he had always managed to be, at some cost, to his patients. There was time, in the 4 hours before the cutter's scheduled departure, for a specific and deliberate leave-taking that none of them had anticipated meeting but all of them found themselves grateful for. Elena walked the garden rows one final time, running her hand along plants she had tended for 2 years, unable to fully articulate, even to herself, the strangeness of leaving behind something she had grown from nothing and would, in all likelihood, never see again. Marcus and Caleb walked up to the ridge together, one last time, to look out at the horizon from the summit where they had first understood the island's full shape, saying little, the silence between them carrying the specific weight of 2 brothers who had built an entire shared history in a place that existed on no map either of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Zoe sat for a long while at the cave's mouth with her chart, adding what she understood, even as she wrote it, would be one of the final entries she'd make in this particular notebook, in this particular place. Finn insisted on saying a formal goodbye to the garden, to the stream, to the smokehouse, moving from one to the next with a solemnity that made Elena, watching him, both want to laugh and want to cry, and in the end did both. Mara stood apart from the family for a portion of that final morning, looking out at a horizon she had first faced entirely alone, 27 months earlier, in circumstances none of the Jacobsons would ever fully know the details of. David found her there and stood beside her without speaking for a while. "You saved us," he finally said. "I want you to know we understand that. Not just the radio. Everything. You saved me first," Mara said. "I was alone 4 months before you got here. I don't know how much longer I would have lasted on my own, believing no one was ever coming. You gave me a family to be part of before you ever gave me a way off this island." David picked up a flat stone from the tide line before he climbed into the Zodiac, black volcanic rock, smooth as glass, warm from 2 years of sun, and put it in his pocket, a small, deliberate act of taking something of the island with him that he could not have fully explained if asked, and that no one in his family needed him to explain. Chapter 26, Bondo. Processing in Bongao took 4 days, interviews, paperwork, a maritime authority genuinely uncertain what category of miracle it was filing, medical examinations that found the family, remarkably, in better overall physical condition than most of the examining doctors expected, though each of them carried some small permanent mark of the 2 years, a scar on Marcus's foot from the long-heeled stonefish injury, a hairline once fractured rib of David's that had knit slightly crooked, a resilience in all of them that no examination could measure but that every doctor who spoke with them noted, in some form, in their reports. Mara Santos was reunited, in an airport lounge that none of the Jacobsons would ever be able to describe without their voices catching, with university colleagues who had listed her as presumed dead 14 months earlier, a reunion involving enough tears and disbelieving embraces that the airport staff eventually, gently, asked the group to relocate to a quieter section of the terminal. The abandoned boat and its cargo, reported in full detail by David and Marcus, prompted a joint investigation between Philippine and Malaysian maritime authorities that the family would follow, at a careful distance, for the next year from newspaper coverage Zoe printed out and kept in a folder separate from her notebooks, a small private archive of the story's final, official chapter. David spent the first night in a hotel room in Bongao unable to sleep, lying in a bed with clean sheets, in a room with air conditioning, unable to close his eyes without seeing the island. Elena lay next to him, equally awake. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," he said. "And nothing." "I keep thinking about the prayer I said on the raft," Elena said. "The first night. I told God that if we got through it, I would spend the rest of my life giving thanks. I would never take anything for granted again." David reached for her hand. And I didn't," she said. "Not the way I promised. But now I'm wondering if that's the real gift. Not the gratitude, exactly. The awareness. The ability to see what you have, really see it, because you know how fast it can disappear." Chapter 27, What Came Back with Them. The adjustment back into ordinary life took longer than the 2 years on the island had, in some ways, though it happened in smaller and less dramatic increments, spread across the following year rather than concentrated into any single dramatic reckoning. David returned to surgery that October and found himself pausing, before each operation, in a way his residents mistook at first for hesitation and eventually understood was something closer to reverence, a deliberate moment, before the first incision, of simply being present to the fact of another human life in his hands, a habit that several colleagues would later tell him had visibly changed the way he taught, the way he explained procedures to frightened patients, the way he sat with families in waiting rooms rather than simply delivering updates and moving on. Elena went back to writing, though her blog's voice had changed in ways her readers noticed and, in overwhelming numbers, responded to, less about optimizing a life and more about noticing one. An unplanned shift that quadrupled her readership within 6 months and that she found she could not have manufactured on purpose if she'd tried. Her long-delayed book manuscript, restarted from scratch, was finished within 4 months of the family's return, written in a voice entirely different from the proposal she'd originally sold, and her publisher, after some initial hesitation, agreed the new version was better. Marcus deferred his residency applications by 1 full cycle, retook a portion of his MCAT with a score that startled even him, and switched his intended specialty from general surgery to emergency medicine without ever fully explaining why. Those who had watched him work the observation post through 6 tense weeks in the island's second autumn, who had watched him engineer a working water system from bamboo and rope, who had watched him steady a family of frightened people through a night with a boat searching their beach in the dark, did not need the explanation. Caleb enrolled in a graduate ecology program the following year, his thesis proposal built around 2 years of field notes on a single unnamed island's plant communities that no other researcher on Earth had ever documented as closely. Working title Adaptive Strategies of Island Plant Communities in the Southern Sulu Archipelago, a document his eventual graduate advisor would call. Reading the notebooks the proposal was built on. Some of the most rigorous amateur field documentation she had encountered in 20 years of teaching. Zoe's first published piece, a National Geographic youth feature titled, At Her Insistence, 2 Years on an Island No One Could Name, ran the following spring, illustrated with pen sketches drawn entirely from memory, since she had never once had a working camera to document any of it directly. The piece drew enough attention that a literary agent reached out within a month asking whether she'd consider expanding it into something longer, a possibility Zoe found herself, at 15, seriously and excitedly considering. Finn started 5th grade in September. Asked by his teacher to share something about his summer, he spoke for 4 uninterrupted minutes about the parrotfish, the sound of monsoon rain through a limestone chimney, the taste of the island's first successful yam harvest, and the exact moment 2 years earlier when a dog had sat down 10 meters away and waited to be trusted. The class was silent when he finished. His teacher's note home to Elena read, simply, "Your son sees the world differently than other children. This is an extraordinary gift. Please protect it." Elena kept the note. She keeps most things now, a tenderness towards small physical evidence that the island gave her and that she has never tried to give back. The black volcanic stone sits on David's desk, and he still picks it up some mornings before his first patient, turning it in his fingers, still working out, 2 years after the rescue, as he suspects he will be working out for the rest of his life, exactly who the island made him instead of the man who boarded the Celestia. Mara Santos returned to her research and published, the following year, a paper on the marine biodiversity of the Sulu archipelago that included, in its acknowledgments, a note about the period of extended fieldwork that had provided certain of the observational data. Her colleagues, reading between those carefully chosen words, did not press